1, 2, 3, 4. Chaps at control, can you hear me? No crunchiness? Can you give me a thumbs up, please, if you're happy? 1, 2, 3, 4. Sean? 1, 2. Are you okay? Yes?
Welcome to today's Economy Committee meeting, where we will be discussing apprenticeships in London. Could I ask everyone to switch your electronic devices to silent mode to avoid any interruptions this morning, including turning off the buzzing, because it does vibrate through the desk onto the microphone. And now if I could ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, do we have any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. We haven't got any apologies for absence today, but we are joined virtually by Assemblymember Bakari and Assemblymember Harani.
Okay, declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Okay, item 3. Can I ask the committee to note the chairing arrangements for the Economy Committee as agreed by the London Assembly at Mayor's Question Time meeting on the 20th of January 2022 as outlined in the agenda?
Noted.
Specifically that it's now me sitting here for my first and I hope very smooth chairing of this committee.
That's impossible. It won't be smooth.
And item 4, can we confirm the minutes of the Economy Committee meeting held on the 10th of December 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Confirmed.
Brilliant. Okay, and can I ask the committee to note the completed and ongoing actions from previous committee meetings?
Noted.
Brilliant. And finally, action under delegated authority. The committee is recommended to note the recent action taken under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members and to agree the committee's report on rebuilding London's nighttime economy.
Noted.
Excellent. Okay, we now come to our main business this morning, which is apprenticeships in London. I'd like to welcome our panel of guests this morning. We have Simon Ashworth, who's the Director of Policy, the Association of Employment and Learning Providers and Vice Chair of the Skills for Londoners, their High-Level Skills Advisory Group. We have Michelle Cuomo-Bora, the Assistant Director for Skills and Employment at the GLA. We have Anna Ambrose, who is the Director of London Progression Collaboration. And we have Stephen Evans, who is the Chief Executive of the Learning and Work Institute. And also joining us in a short while is Jules Pipe, the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, who sends his apologies for lateness, but should be with us shortly. So welcome, everyone. Hopefully you have instructions with you on how to use the microphones. You need to press the little face button to turn them on or off for those of you who haven't used them before. So if we now move on to the questions that we have for our guests this morning, and I'll kick off, I think, with a nice broad question. So I'll go around the guests in turn. If I start with Simon on my left. Is the current apprenticeship system delivering outcomes such as progression into work or further training, particularly for disadvantaged groups? And do we have data on outcomes and satisfaction? Is that data being collected sufficiently either at national or London level? So, good morning, and if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, morning, Chair. Thanks for the...
Had some difficulties with the microphones. I didn't mention that because we thought that we had them all solved, but it might be that we don't have them completely solved. So if you want to have another go, Simon, and if not, we might have to adjourn to sort out some microphones.
Would you mind just repeating the question, please, Chair, if that's all right?
Yeah, sorry. So it was a very broad question, really. So is the apprenticeship delivering the outcomes that it's supposed to, such as progression through to work or to further training and education? And are we collecting the data at the London level or the national level to kind of keep track of the outcomes and the satisfaction apprentices taking up those apprenticeships.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Chair. I'll kind of kick off. Obviously, one of the original objectives of the apprenticeship reforms and the apprenticeship levy system was all about driving participation in apprenticeships generally. The government set a quite ambitious target around 3 million starts for apprenticeships by 2020. I think, unfortunately, one of the big challenges has been a slow uptake on recruitment as a consequence of some of the apprenticeship reforms generally in the apprenticeship levy system, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. I think apprenticeships as a product are very much a proven product. Over 90% of apprentices who complete their apprenticeship stay on in employment. But I think you make a pertinent point around progression. I mean, progression can be measured in a number of different ways. I think progression from one apprenticeship to another level apprenticeship is still far too low, and that's a kind of key challenge to encourage individuals to progress from level 2 to level 3 and up through the progression ranks. I think in terms of data and other such like and sort of challenges around disadvantaged, I think one of the big challenges around the apprenticeship reforms has been a focus on existing staff and upskilling existing adults. And I think the statistics show around sort of 50% of apprentices are existing staff. So there's big challenges around getting more young people, more disadvantaged individuals into apprenticeships. And that's probably been one of the challenges with the reforms and moving to very much a system dominated by large employers. Certainly smaller employers typically have taken younger learners, disadvantaged learners into jobs. And I think that is probably one of the challenges that still resonates within the system that needs sort of addressing as we move forward.
Okay, thank you very much. So since Deputy Mayor Pipe is just taking his seat, why don't I ask Stephen to answer the question next, and then we'll move back around the other way.
Great, thank you, Chair. Yes, I agree with a lot of what Simon said. We know that there's lots of brilliant apprenticeships. Apprenticeships can make a real difference. There's really great evidence about that and about the earnings and employment impacts of them as well. So we kind of know that, particularly at a sort of England level and to an extent below that as well. But we know that the numbers of apprenticeships have fallen in the last few years, particularly. They weren't overly high to start with, and then after the levy-based reforms, which we can talk a bit more about, perhaps, happy to say more about that, they fell further, and then the pandemic comes and they fall further too. So there is a point about numbers, and that's particularly true in London, I think, and again, happy to talk about that. The progression point and the access points, I think, are the two critical ones here. So we know the best apprenticeships are brilliant. We know we need more of them, but it's who gets them and at what level and who's progressing. So we've had great growth at higher apprenticeship level, and that's particularly true in London as well. Higher apprenticeships are brilliant. We need more of them, but not at the expense of entry-level opportunities for young people. And that lack of progression on, I think, or lack of data on it as well, I think is a big gap. And access points, so making sure that everyone has a fair chance to get an apprenticeship, regardless of their background. I think that points to Simon's point that we need to have a particular focus on young people and new starters in roles as opposed to older existing members of staff. So I guess that's where my state of play would sit.
Okay, thank you very much. Anna, what I can remind you of the question if you like. Or, no.
Thank you very much. I would also echo much of what's been said. I think, there is, at a high level at least, good evidence of some of the pay rise and promotion outcomes for apprentices in the kind of year following their apprenticeship. I think there's more kind of granular data needed on those kind of progression outcomes, and in particular on what progression outcomes are really important for those learners, as well as what we might want to look at a macro level. And I think, thinking about the impacts of levy reforms on apprenticeship starts for young people, as we've heard, the drop of apprenticeships, particularly at the lower levels, especially at level 2, which is obviously a really critical stepping stone for many young people into employment. And a really important part of that kind of Venn diagram, I think, where we see a big overlap in the middle is the really significant drop in apprenticeships offered by smaller businesses as a result of the levy reforms. So we know that starts in small and medium-sized businesses dropped by 40 and 45% respectively following the introduction of the levy. And I think addressing that in order to address some of those access issues for particular groups is really critical.
Okay, thank you. Actually, we're going to come on in a moment to a question about the levy. So if I could welcome the Deputy Mayor to join us this morning. I'll repeat my question. It was a very broad opening question, really, which was looking at the current apprenticeship system, is it delivering the outcomes in terms of progression, either into work or into further training, and particularly for disadvantaged groups? And the data on outcomes and satisfaction for the apprentices, are we collecting sufficient data to measure that properly, either in London or nationally? Sorry, yes, I do apologise. We've gone around the room and you found yourself in the next up.
For my lateness, actually, sorry, thank you, Chair. I apologise for my lateness. Actually, I was speaking actually at the Association of Employment and Learning Providers Conference, who clearly Simon is giving up the opportunity to be at this morning. The issue was the green economy, which obviously is a potential great source of apprenticeships in the future if we had the system to help deliver it. I mean, I think probably your other guests have already covered probably the headlines of what I'd say. There has been a noticeable dip in apprenticeship numbers since the introduction of the levy. We can share the numbers that we have. I'm sure we all have our own stats on that, but it's dropped from around sort of the mid-40s, 40,000 a year down to sort of the mid-30s in recent years. And the levy, people, as you know, we've discussed this before, employers do have a problem using all their levy, and this is obviously impacting numbers. We know that not all the levy is spent. About £1 billion fund expires a year nationally. A recent survey by London First found that something like, or less than a fifth of businesses find that for themselves that the apprenticeship system is working well, and about half of businesses surveyed didn't spend their levy fund in full. I'm sure we'll get on to the progression collaboration in detail later on, but we do think that there are ways forward that can improve that situation. It was a very good pilot programme, and it's worth discussing that later in the meeting.
Well, in actual fact, my next question was going, you've touched on it already, so my next question was going to be about the levy and what's worked well and what hasn't worked. So I don't know whether you wanted to add anything to what you've just said, because you have just spoken about that. So,
I mean, I'm happy to state those headlines, and others to fill in the detail. I'm happy to come back.
Okay. Simon, did you want to? So the question was on the apprenticeship levy specifically. What's worked well? What could be better?
I think. I mean, I'd start off by saying that the apprenticeship levy itself has been a huge game-changing opportunity. It's nearly doubled the amount of investment that's available in apprenticeships. I think certainly in the national press, there seems to be, we tend to get confusion around the levy system and the levy itself in terms of what some of the challenges are. So actually the investment in skills and apprenticeships is fantastic. I think that the levy system, as it's kind of also referred to, and I think Jules kind of touched on that, so the whole kind of infrastructure about how employers access apprenticeships, the system, what they can choose, I still think there are some kind of real challenges in that. It is ultimately a system that's been built for large employers. At the heart of it, the 22,000 employers that pay the levy. It's certainly quite a clunky system for non-levy paying employers to access the system, engage with apprenticeships. The number of small employers is still particularly low. And a couple of years ago, we moved from direct contracting from providers who would engage with smaller employers and do a lot of the heavy lifting and hidden wiring to a system which was fully demand-led, which meant that smaller employers had much greater choice, but had to move through an online portal and kind of get connected. And we certainly see with micro-employers, that's a real challenge. So I think that the levy itself is fantastic. I think there's some challenges around the actual levy infrastructure. I mean, I'll just kind of end really by coming back to some of the hypotheses around the levy itself. So the idea really is quite a clever design, is that levy payers were never meant to spend the levy. 50% of the levy was supposed to be unspent, and that funds the 98% of employers who don't pay the levy. So absolutely, there is a challenge around a misconception, I guess, sold to certainly large employers, that they would get 10% more than they put in for the levy. But actually, if levy payers spent all the levy that was available, it would actually restrict the amount of funding available for 98% of employers who don't pay the levy. You know, the SMEs, which used to be the backbone of the apprenticeship system until sort of 4 or 5 years ago. So a few things there just to kind of throw into the conversation, I guess.
It sounds like the challenge is to make sure that is it that smaller employers then are just missing out relative to where they were before, or relative to where they could be? And is there a way of reorganizing it, do you think, that would get smaller employers into the system?
Yeah, well, I mean, before the levy reforms that came in 2017, 2/3 of apprenticeships were for small employers. And one of the things we have seen with the reforms is, a big swing to levy payers, large employers who train existing staff on high-level skills. So we have swung from a system that large employers weren't very engaged with to actually being very pivotal, really, in the system. So I think there's still a lot of work to do to incentivise smaller employers to engage with apprenticeships, to do some of the heavy lifting and the administration to connect up all the dots to get them onto the system and engaged in apprenticeship. So, and also, thinking about incentives around young people and not disincentivizing upskilling and retraining adults. I think that's really important, but I think there needs to be more weight and more focus on certainly trying to encourage new recruits into the apprenticeship system. 16 to 18 apprenticeships only account for about 20% of all apprenticeships now, which is an all-time low. So some more statistics around, are we spending too much money on retraining and reskilling, which is really important, but do we need to tip the balance a bit more to new skills, new development, filling those job roles, which is really important.
Okay, thank you. Anna, what were your thoughts on the levy system, how that's working?
Thank you, Chair. And I think there have been some positives. I think, we've seen the levy directing large amount of funding to apprenticeships, which we know are a highly effective form of work-based training, as opposed to what might be perhaps easier skills products for people to engage with, but which perhaps don't have the kind of impact that we see from apprenticeships. And along with that, we've obviously seen a huge growth in the level of expertise within large levy-paying employers in how to create really high-impact apprenticeship programs, which I think, in terms of the level of expertise in the system, is a real positive. I think, one of the major challenges from our perspective is that there is nothing within the levy system to direct a proportion of funds, perhaps, towards the individuals who we know have the most to gain from apprenticeships. So young people, disadvantaged groups, groups who are perhaps underrepresented in particular sectors, and those needing to reskill and retrain as the economy changes. So, whilst the levy has worked well in some ways, I think the way in which it has kind of skewed who is benefiting from apprenticeships is a real challenge. And I think the impact on small businesses is interesting. I think we had a particular challenge around funding for non-levy payers at the start of the levy's introduction, when there were quite tightly ring-fenced amounts of co-investment funding available. And my hypothesis would be that turned off small businesses who had previously been engaged, and we're struggling at this point, I would imagine, to get them back. I can't give you kind of hard evidence that that's been the impact, but I think there's a kind of logical deduction there. But I would also say that I don't think that all the barriers to small businesses engaging are levy-based. I think there are other complexities within the system which pose a challenge for SME engagement as well.
Thank you very much. Stephen.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the challenges here is that the government didn't set out when the levy and other related reforms were introduced what the ultimate purpose and success measures were. So all of our answers are based on what we think it should be, rather than a sort of set of criteria set out at the start. But I think some of the really good things from all of those reforms are the extra money that's going into apprenticeships, full stop. The focus that it's given for particularly larger employers, some of whom weren't engaged in the system before. So we've got more focus, we've got more engagement. Also, because the levy was introduced at the same time as standards were being developed, and things like minimum durations for apprenticeships and those sorts of things, where the government, the stated intention is to improve quality. You know, we've had lots of growth of higher apprenticeships, which, as I said before, is a good thing, but not at the expense of everything else. So there's lots of good stuff there. But I think that the challenge is, firstly, apprenticeships for young people and new starters, which have gone from low to very low. And there's very little incentive in the system, as I think Anna was saying, to change that. But also, it is a bit clunky. You know, I'm a small employer who knows a little bit about this stuff, and I find it a bit tricky to engage in these things. And then the other point is slightly heretical for hearing about apprenticeships, but there is more to life than apprenticeships as well. And training and workforce development and lifelong learning is about more than apprenticeships. And some of my worry is that the levy squeezes out that wider conversation, and then we try to make everything an apprenticeship, and it just isn't. So I think that sort of, I would argue, for that sort of broader approach. Apprenticeships are brilliant, but they're not the answer to everything.
Thank you. That's interesting, and I certainly welcome heretical comments. If I may, I just had a note from our technical people. If anyone has their phone, which I actually did until 2 seconds ago, or some other device next to their microphone, this might be one of the causes of our crackly microphone problem. So just before we move on, if you have, I literally have my phone sitting next to it, so I'm guilty as charged on this. But if you could just move it a short distance away, apparently that will help. So that rounds up my opening questions. If I can hand over to Assemblymember Ahmed, who's going to ask the next section.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. Over the last 5 years, apprenticeship numbers have fallen in London, particularly for young people and for apprenticeships at lower levels, reflecting the national trend. Why is this, and what action needs to be taken to reverse this trend? And so the question is directed at Anna, Stephen and Simon, please. So Anna, if you'd like to start.
Thank you. And I think the reasons for those falls are really related to what we've spoken about at a national level. I think there are elements of London's kind of sectoral mix in terms of the businesses within the capital, which perhaps have exacerbated some of those trends that we see nationally, so towards the higher level apprenticeships and towards apprenticeships for older and more experienced workers. And I think, I think therefore addressing those, I think is challenging where policy sits at a national level. I think there are a limited number of actions which can be taken at a regional level to address those. I think what we've seen from the pilot of the London Progression Collaboration, which supports particularly smaller businesses to access apprenticeships and supports large employers to transfer some of their unspent levy funds to support small businesses, is that, with the investment and with the resource that we're able to put into it, it's possible to make those funds move around and benefit both the businesses and the individuals who have the most to gain from the system and who are perhaps at risk of missing out. But I think we've also seen very strongly that there is a lot of practical support needed to help small businesses in the capital engage with apprenticeships, aside from helping the funds to move around in a more effective way.
Can you just, you talked about about more help needed for small businesses. Could you just elaborate on that, please?
Yes, certainly. What we find, and I think this has been reinforced in research published by the St Martin's Group fairly recently, and some of the work of the APPG on apprenticeships, finds that at every step of implementing apprenticeships, there are challenges for smaller businesses. And those steps include choosing an apprenticeship standard, which is the right match for the business and the right match for the individual. That includes finding an apprenticeship training provider when there is, such a wide range of provision in the system, from, perhaps local colleges to large national independent training providers to very specialist sector-focused training providers. And then kind of going through the recruitment process, if this is an apprenticeship for a new start, and then engaging with the digital apprenticeship system. And, we find small businesses need support at each of those steps. And I think there's a real challenge, which I'm sure Simon can speak to with greater evidence than I can. But I think there's a real challenge for providers in the fact that, there is nothing within the way the system is funded to support them to give that level of support to smaller businesses, which requires so much more investment in terms of time and capacity than dealing with, the likes of Amazon or American Express or someone who has that large infrastructure around apprenticeships. So I think there can be a real gap for small businesses in finding someone to kind of hold their hand and walk them through that process, perhaps for the first time or the first time in a while. And, that's when we're talking about small businesses who are interested in the system, let alone all those who perhaps don't think it's for them.
Okay, thank you. Stephen?
So I think there's, before the levy and just going back decades, employers have been about 4 times more likely to train people with degree level qualifications than employees with no qualifications. And public policy always aimed to try and tackle that disparity and say, look, there's a market failure here, and so we need to support and invest in and encourage training, particularly for those with the fewest qualifications. And the levy has just kind of changed that and taken that away to a large extent. So now it's up to employers to choose, and they're choosing what they've always chosen, which is to invest more in those with the highest skills already. And those are more expensive apprenticeships. So for any given levy budget, you're going to get fewer numbers of apprenticeships at the end. So I think there's a kind of thing about what's the purpose of public policy, and this is the inevitable consequence of the system that's been set up. There's then a delivery point. Anna was talking about this a bit just now. Now what the system is that large employers have money taken off them by the taxman, which then sits in a digital account, which they can then log in and access, and they can talk to an SME who also has to set up an account, and then they can work out a transfer mechanism, but as long as they agree to spend it on an apprenticeship within a certain timeline. This is not easy, and it's a bit clunky. And it links to a point that we found in our research where we've spoken with employers, lots of whom, and many of whom, want to get involved and want to, build their talent pipeline and help young people and others more generally, but they're a bit confused by what the offer is. So do you want to do apprenticeships, T-level industry placements, sector-based work academies, traineeships, work experience, workplace? The list goes on. This is confusing. What do you want me to do? So I do think there's a big role for the GLA as well as for local authorities and others to think, how do we help employers to navigate that system and to prioritise what's best for me as an employer, what would work for me as an employer. And then just last point, London has always had a proportionately lower number of apprenticeships compared to its population, or I say always, certainly the last 20 years or so. And partly that's because it's got an already higher skilled workforce, and it's got a predominance of industries where apprenticeships have traditionally been lower. But for me, that says we need to particularly focus on those industries and those sectors and think, well, how can we build apprenticeships there? Are the current standards working, or what are the progression pathways up to those higher levels as well? So I think there's a particular sectoral focus that we need within London as well.
Okay, thank you. Simon?
Just kind of building on kind of comments by colleagues, but as I mentioned, young people is at an all-time low. 20% of apprenticeship starts 16 to 18. I think Level 2 apprenticeships are also on a significant decline. I think they account for about 25% of all apprenticeships nationally, and that's kind of certainly reduced over time. A number of factors here. Some of it is the availability of provision at level 2. There's been an ongoing dispute with the government and employers around the availability of popular replacement programs such as business administration, which used to be a really important entry route for lots of young people and adults. And various trailblazer groups have tried to convince the government to develop a standard around business administration at level 2, and that's been repelled a number of times. I kind of see these things kind of linking together. So young people, lower level, small employers, actually, they're all interlinked in terms of, if you can address part of that challenge, it will drive, the other parts of that as well. I think initially when the apprenticeship levy came in, there was a lot of focus from large employers and pressure to spend the levy. And the easiest thing to do was to put existing staff on programs on high-level skills because they were more expensive and they'd utilise the levy more quickly. So I think there was some tactical nature in terms of, what employers targeted first in terms of skills priorities. I mean, there are some other kind of challenges in the system at the moment. I mean, certainly for non-levy paying employers, there's a cap on the number of starts they can take. So there is a cap of 10. So there's a number of employers that do want to take more than 10 apprentices, but are capped. And that kind of forces them down the route of levy transfer. And I think levy transfer is a good initiative. It gives employers choice, but it is quite clunky in terms of finding the money and connecting it. And we've already talked about the complexities of the system. So it seems very arbitrary that, where employers do want that growth, they are limited and have to go through kind of additional hurdles. One area we haven't really touched on is about the supply side of young people. Still a big challenge around effective careers, information, advice and guidance around vocational training and apprenticeships. We're seeing at the moment with the skills bill and how the Baker Clause should be enforced within schools to make young people more aware of opportunities other than an academic route. So awareness of young people and parents about apprenticeships is still a challenge. I think degree apprenticeships have been fantastic around resonating the brand, but I still think there's a big piece of work to do to make sure that enough young people recognise what apprenticeships can do. And then just to kind of touch on Anna's point around incentives, you're being honest around, from a provider perspective, if you're supporting a small employer with only wants one learner, the cost of helping support, recruit, induct and train them, and if they're also a younger person, the more intense support that's required, there's a higher cost to that as opposed to working with an employer who's already got existing employees and supporting them through an apprenticeship. So we did move from a system pre-apprenticeship reform where 16 to 18 was fully funded by the government. Adult apprenticeships was co-funded. So there was a real incentive to recognise the additional cost and effort to help transition young people or individuals into work onto an apprenticeship as opposed to focusing purely on sort of existing staff. So some of it is around sort of incentives, awareness, capacity within the marketplace. There's a three-legged stool around apprenticeships. You need to make sure you've got providers, you've got the capacity, you need to make sure you've got the employer-led demand, and you've also got to make sure there's the interest from the learners as well. And sometimes I think that not all three parts of those three-legged stools are always where they need to be be firing on all cylinders.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask my next few questions very specifically about London situation. And I really appreciate some quite brief answers before the new chair gets done for murder of one of the Assembly members. Given that these are national trends, and we've looked at that, and we've looked very specifically about the London situation, which, Stephen, you said that we've always had a traditionally lower rate of apprenticeships here, and the reasons that you've given. And the apprenticeship funding was not devolved to the Mayor in the education adult budget. How much power does the Mayor actually have over increasing apprenticeship numbers in London? And does this require national government action? And I wonder if we could start with you then, Stephen.
Yes, so I'd probably pick up on three things where I think the Mayor can play a really important role. The first is in raising demand for apprenticeships from both employers and young people. So that the Mayor has lots of engagement with employers and the Mayor's team, So using that engagement to raise that demand, raise interest, raise awareness, that sort of thing. And if that's successful, then more money will flow into London and more apprenticeships will happen in London. So I think it's less about controlling the supply, the money, and it's more about raising the demand, I would argue. So that's one thing I think the Mayor's got a really important role in. The second is about whether the apprenticeship standards are meeting London's needs. So that's partly about the fact, as I said earlier, London has a different sectoral mix to other parts of the country. So do those standards meet employer needs? But also the way those sectors operate in London is different as well. So is it meeting employers' needs? And then the third is, I guess, sort of seeing does the system as a whole stack up. So it's not just about apprenticeships, it's about how does apprenticeships link to employment programmes, to literacy and numeracy training, to other things. I think the Mayor has a really important convening role to try and bring some of those things together and to test new ways of working as well. So those would be the three areas I would argue for. But the other things that I mentioned earlier, that needs national government action.
Thank you very much. Simon.
Very much kind of building on what Stephen said. I mean, ultimately, apprenticeships are a nationally contracted programme, and it's highly likely that they will stay that way. I think there is the piece around raising awareness with employers and individuals and parents, and I think the Mayor's got a role on that. You know, one of the other things we've seen in some of the other combined authorities is the Mayor providing additional funding to top up wage incentives to support very targeted approaches to small employers or micro businesses to take disadvantaged learners. So that might be something. There's a financial aspect to that. I think the mayors as a group are very influential, so kind of influencing policy. You know, talked about the cap of 10, you know, the more needs to be done for SME. So not necessarily a financial contribution, but also I think the influencing of national policy. And kind of really building on the work of the LPC, and I think, you know, the work around levy transfer, I think there's potentially more work that could be done to kind of pilot and support more smaller micro businesses engage with the apprenticeship service and system. I think the LPC has very much kind of led the way around levy transfer. We've just seen that, you know, last year the government has moved to a national system around levy donations and pledges. So innovation like that, I think, can drive change. And I think there's some of the things that the Mayor could look at for influencing for London purposes, for Londoners.
Thank you. Anna.
Thank you. Very much to echo what's been said, really. I think building on the point around the potential role, building appetite, and thinking particularly on the business side where we've been focused, I think there's an opportunity not just to build a sort of general appetite for apprenticeships, but to really focus on the groups that we want to be creating apprenticeships for within London and the sectors where we want to see that, you know, both in terms of providing opportunities for individuals and also addressing some of the really serious skill shortages which we know are affecting businesses in the capital at the moment. And I think, you know, that's clearly linked to some of the Academy's work, which I know is ongoing at the moment. I think there's a real opportunity which can work highly effectively at the London level to join up schemes better. Echoing what Stephen has said, I think what we've seen, you know, predating COVID from our experience is a real disconnect between some of the pre-employment work which is undertaken and routes into apprenticeships. So, you know, we have great third sector partners, for example, who are offering pre-employment work with particular groups saying we've got apprenticeship ready candidates, and yet we see employers who are struggling to recruit to their apprenticeship vacancies. And, you know, all the different routes that we have kind of growing and having come on board more recently around boot camps, etc., and Kickstart Program, you know, that just kind of magnifies the issue where actually at a local level I think we could do some really effective work to join those pathways up better, both for employers and for individuals. And then finally, I think there is a real opportunity, you know, kind of building on our pilot really to make sure that that support is there for small businesses at a local level. The APPG on apprenticeships called for a national network of one-stop shops for small businesses to access support for apprenticeships. You could broaden that to skills interventions more generally, and perhaps make that even more effective. But I think there's a real opportunity for some really effective work with small businesses locally.
You just mentioned the Kickstart Program. Were issues in... Is there a problem? No. There were issues with take-up of Kickstart previously. Can you just very briefly give an idea, how are we with that in London now? Is Kickstart being taken up?
Shall I?
Yeah, please do.
I mean, it's across the whole of the UK. It's much lower than was originally budgeted for, and that includes in London. Now, the government will argue that's partly because the labour market did better than we expected, and therefore youth unemployment didn't spike as high as was feared at the time they announced the plan for jobs. I would say it's also because that was another sort of slightly clunky scheme for employers to access. It's a really good intervention, but we needed more focus on actually how people finish their Kickstart job and then move on to an apprenticeship. This is a joining up point as well. So definitely take up much lower than originally budgeted for, partly because the economy's not done as badly as feared, but also because it's a bit clunky.
Okay, thank you. My final question, Chair. So we know that there's been a real issue with certain types of industry, so health, public services and care, leisure, travel and tourism, retail and commercial enterprise in London, with regard to the levels of decline in those areas. They tend to be sectors which where previous concerns have been raised about using apprenticeships as a way to reduce labour costs, and we know that these are already low-paid industries. Has the introduction of the standards that we've seen been the reason for this decline, and what can we do to encourage talent into these sectors if apprenticeships are not the answer?
Right, is that working? I can kick off. So I think your question was how can we encourage into those sectors? So one of the things, and we've had a fantastic week.
Encourage into those sectors and not allow those sectors to be used as a low-paid way of building employment within those sectors. Thank you.
So you will have, hopefully, noticed this week that the Mayor launched a number of initiatives. Two key ones, I think, around the question you've just asked. One was the campaign, which is to try and encourage Londoners to take up jobs in those sectors that you've just spoken about, so in hospitality, in green jobs, particularly green construction, into digital, into health and care, all of those key sectors, creative industries and others. So there is a campaign now going on where we're trying to encourage Londoners into those. And then the parallel to that is working through the Mayor's Academy programme, which was also launched on Monday, which is a £44 million initiative to do just what you said. So it's to get Londoners who are either unemployed or at risk of redundancy through various different means into work in those sectors, but really importantly, into good work in those sectors. So the programme is entirely set up around the initiative where we will help to coordinate all the things that we've had about this morning, so Kickstart, apprenticeships, the adult education budget, all of the kind of resources we have, boot camps hopefully will come into that as well. Pulling that all together, working with employers where they have high levels of vacancies, but also then trying to encourage Londoners to go into those jobs where they don't necessarily know that those vacancies or even those career paths exist. Working with those employers to ensure that they are good jobs, and what we mean by that is paying the London living wage, so at least the London living wage, and also working towards the Mayor's Good Work standard as a key part of that. We're also doing a lot of work with those employers within the Academies programme to support them to bring in diverse communities into those workforces. Each of those sectors has slightly different sort of issues, I suppose, in terms of diversity, but through the Workforce Integration Network, we'll be providing support to those employers to make sure that they're also recruiting and addressing the issues within their workforce from those diverse communities and those most affected by the pandemic. So there's a sort of huge amount of work going into that at the moment, where we hope we'll be able to address some of those concerns that we've set out as well. The other side of that is also another programme called the No Wrong Door. And
Sorry, could you say that again? The
No Wrong Door.
No Wrong Door. Thank you.
It does what it says on the tin, hopefully. Hopefully it means that a Londoner can go to one of our services and they wouldn't be turned away. Working with our local authorities, they will be providing that network of information to Londoners to help them get the right skills, the right kind of information or support to get them back into work. And again, linking that very, very clearly to good work.
Thank you. Jules.
What is there to add? There's no point in me repeating.
Okay, no, that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. And Stephen.
Yes, I mean, the sorts of things that Michelle's just described, I think, are exactly the sort of things you would want the Mayor to be doing in terms of some targeted investment where there are things that the mainstream system isn't doing, but also then trying to join these things up for people and for employers as well. I guess the sort of, there's quite a specific point around apprentice pay that I'd probably flag as well. So most sectors, most apprentices get paid way more than the apprentice minimum wage, but you've highlighted some of the sectors where that is less the case. And in fact, there was a Department for Education report, big survey a couple of years ago, which showed that 1 in 5 apprentices across England, and I think this was true for London within that, reported being paid below the legal minimum wage for apprentices as well. So I think there's a sort of big piece of work there, not just on encouraging employers to pay the London living wage quite right, and we're proud to be a London living wage employer, for example, but also making sure apprentices know what they're entitled to and what to do if that's not happening. So I think there's a big thing about people understanding their rights and how to enforce them. And actually, I think training providers can play a big role in that as brokers between people and employers as well. So I just add that in as well.
Right, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Bailey.
Morning. Can I just adjust my question to Stephen and then to Simon? To what extent is this low take-up a function of London's employment market? We have a very particular employment market. So what effect is that having?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. So there's a sort of general decline that we've seen across England, mirrored in London, which I think is related back to some of the issues we talked about before with how the levy is designed and implemented. But then London has always been lower down on the league table of English regions, partly because I think of the different makeup of London's workforce, so more highly qualified, but also the sectoral makeup where you've got sectors that haven't traditionally taken on apprentices. So that's why I think it's really important that the Mayor and the boroughs and others think about how do we make sure we've got good apprenticeships designed for those sectors that dominate in London, and they're designed for employer needs as well, and then we can push London up the league tables.
Okay.
I think just to add to Stephen's comments, I think the government is introducing some flexibilities quite well at the moment around flexible apprenticeships. Certainly in sectors like creative. I'm sure we might talk about this a bit later around portal apprenticeships and flexi job schemes as well. So different approaches for different industries that might have a more of a positive impact potentially on London and other areas based on the types of employers and the types of sectors as well. So there are some developments on that. And just going back to the point on take-up, one of the other challenges around London is travel costs. That is sometimes something we hear from apprentices as the challenge. On wages, we saw an increase in the number of employers who were paying the apprenticeship minimum wage during the height of the pandemic. But actually, we did some research recently which showed that the number of vacancies at the apprenticeship minimum wage had actually reduced significantly to around 20%. So actually, some of it is a demand and supply side around a lot of vacancies at the moment, and a challenge filling those, and that's kind of pushing up wages, and that includes apprenticeships as well. But certainly travel costs in London is something that we know is a challenge for recruitment for apprentices.
Thank you. And I'll direct this next question to Anna. Whose job is it to design attractive, good packages, both for the apprentice and for the employer? Whose job is that, Anna?
I think it's quite a complex answer. The apprenticeship standards themselves, so the programs which employers need to find attractive and which which a learner will follow are employer led. So those are developed by trailblazer groups of employers, as they're called. And overseen by the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education. I think there are, as Simon alluded to earlier, there have been challenges within that process where large numbers of businesses are citing strong demand for particular standards to be developed and are not being given the green light to go ahead and develop those. And the business administration example is perhaps the most often cited, but there are certainly other examples of that. But then you come down to a kind of at an employer level, working with a training provider to design a job, which is an apprenticeship, which is attractive to an individual applicant, an individual learner. And I think that has to be a real partnership between the training provider and the employer. I think we've seen a lot of focus from government on the quality of the off-the-job part of an apprenticeship, so what happens with training providers and all the regulation which sits around that. We've heard far less in many ways about the quality of the on-the-job experience, which is, after all, 8% of an apprentice's time. And I think ultimately we currently know far less about what makes that successful and how to make that not only attractive to an applicant looking for an opportunity at the outset, but how to make that as impactful as possible. And I think that's a real kind of area that deserves greater focus in terms of learning what makes a really high quality apprenticeship in terms of that on-the-job experience, and then sharing that best practice in a way which means more employers can do that.
Thank you. I'll address this next question to Jules and Michelle. Good morning to you both. Given that the Apprenticeship Advisory Group has not been re-established, how is the Mayor engaging with employers and training providers to support the provision of apprenticeships? Because we've just heard how there's a slight disconnect there, and surely this group could fill that gap. Of course, the group no longer exists. So where is the Mayor in this mix?
Right, I'll start and then Jules can come into that. So we have two main sort of boards, I suppose, that sit and focus on these areas. We have the Skills for Londoners board, which is effectively the supply board. So that is a board made up of local authorities, training providers, Association of Employment and Learning Providers actually sit on that group, as well as colleges and other sort of sectoral actors. We also have a partner board, which is more about the demand side, and that's the Skills for Londoners Business Partnership. That has been the sort of owner of the apprenticeship subgroup, which existed, which you've referenced there. Given that the Mayor no longer has a direct role or hasn't got a direct role in apprenticeships, and the commitment is therefore to champion apprenticeships and to work with employers, the Skills for Londoners Business Partnership is going to be focusing on things like the Mayor's academies, where we will be promoting the use of apprenticeships. We'll be hearing from those employers. There's 15 different employers that sit on there representing the sectors that we talked to, that we've mentioned earlier. And they'll be giving their views and helping us support that as well. So there is a continued conversation that happens around apprenticeships. There isn't a specific subgroup on that, mainly because that group actually felt that it had delivered what it was set out to do, and that it would have more impact if the Skills for Londoners Business Partnership took that forward, going forward, and linking it very clearly with the Mayor's Academy programme, where we are also working with a large number of employers to help Londoners get into the various different skills options to help them get a job.
Okay, Jules?
Yeah, as Michelle said, I mean, the mayor has no formal role at all within the apprenticeship system. Yeah, I think it's interesting to note that probably everything that's been discussed today, all the suggestions, bar about top-ups, I think we are actively engaging in a soft sense or a pilot sense because we don't have the formal role or the profit, the full devolved funding. And we'd probably even do top-ups if we were given the money to fund them. But everything else that's been talked about, we are in that space. And whether it's exploring, from the small items like that were raised about travel costs, and the mayor funds top-ups, apprenticeship travel costs, through to the big issues around apprenticeship levy. And the reforms that we'd like to see, and the devolution that we'd like to see there to facilitate the nationwide establishment of the progression collaboration that would unlock all those difficulties that we've heard today about the transfer of unspent levy. And we've heard many reasons why the difficulties that are in existence about why it goes unspent and returned to the Treasury.
It just seems to me that there's a trick being missed here. There's two big things here. There's these very local, small, practical things that are very particular
Recording
to
in
London.
progress.
And there's these very, very big, particular national things. The mayor would have a much greater call on extra powers if he was helping to solve these smaller things, and plus Londoners would like these smaller things solved. Anything from this route, this working with third sectors about employment prep and routes into apprenticeships and stuff like that.
But that's exactly my point. That he is involved in all those things.
But why don't we then have
within the limits of his powers? So, for example, there's been within the skills world, the issue about the levy, for example, has been a big part of the debate over the last couple of years since its introduction, and the fact that it has not seen an increase in apprenticeships. It's particularly seen a further decline in the lower level apprenticeships, because the big employers with the money, if a lot of what they're allowed to get or able to get out of the door, as we've heard today, is on upskilling their existing already higher skilled employees. And that's particularly acute in London because, as Stephen said, the nature of our, the banks in the city don't take on many apprenticeships. There's a limit to how many business admin apprenticeships they might be willing to take on, but they have a supply chain, and they'd be more than happy to push more of that down the supply chain. But when this started, was it 10% was the maximum you could pass down the supply chain? And it's just recently changed to 25. And I think that is as a direct result of the people around this table and the MCAs and the mayor, the other MCAs in the country, and the mayor directly lobbying about what one could do with greater pass-through down the chain. And to your point about the mayor practically doing things in a smaller scale as he's able to, exactly as he did with the London Progression Collaboration, which we funded a third of it. The other two-thirds coming from JP Morgan.
So give me an example, because I fully accept that there's a big national piece here, and if you look at it from the government's perspective, they probably are not in a hurry to set up something entirely separate for London. So I get that. So some of the work that's been done, I think everybody countrywide would appreciate that. But give me an example of some of the smaller, more practical things being done. Because if you're a Londoner, if you're a young person in London, who is helping you see these things? Who's helping you take these apprenticeships on? Who's helping people construct an attractive apprenticeship for younger people in London? Because it's obvious to me why there's been a massive uptake in a higher level. I could always see that coming. What are we doing practically? What is the mayor doing practically to help address the loss for more disadvantaged Londoners?
Well, I think I gave you an example just then.
Yeah, but that was a national example.
No, it wasn't a national example. What we've done is in London ensured that there was money available, £9 million that wasn't there before, by funding 350 from us, 750 from JP Morgan. Thank you, from JP Morgan. So £1 million of input saw £9 million come into lower level apprenticeships, the very kind of ones that we want to see funded, that wouldn't have happened had the not mayor intervened in that way. And it was just London. And that doesn't have to be some big scheme that the government sets up. So one small rule change could be that a small, tiny proportion of the apprenticeship levy could be spent on running such an operation. So if you just look at the LPC, that costs £1 million to do 9 in a very difficult circumstances during the pandemic. If it was possible to have a couple of million out of £100 million worth of transferred levy to fund the operation, that would be a very effective way, and that could be done just with the government changing the rules about what the levy could be spent on, because at the moment it can only be spent on training. It can't be spent on any kind of wraparound support that one would want to give people on apprenticeships, although that is something that we do allow through the AEB and the flexibilities that we've introduced for colleges to give. So you know, that where the mayor has been able to intervene, that does contribute to skills training and apprenticeships, the mayor has intervened.
Okay, just one last try.
I mean, Michelle could probably off the top of her head think of more
examples. I'm just really interested in, and maybe this is to Anna or Simon, I'm really interested in where can the lead come from to make the right apprenticeships for younger people and get them in front of those apprenticeships, because that's the biggest challenge. If you're a Londoner sat in Romford, you don't know these things exist. Is anybody trying to help you find them, or is someone building them in the correct way to make them attractive? And also, Jules, is the mayor doing anything about that in particular?
Yes, I mean that's through the Academies programme and the work that we do with the sector. So, you know, for example, the quality mark that we have for the construction academies, there'll be similar ones for the new academies, for the newer sectors that we've just announced last week. So there we're working with industry and representing the sector bodies from those sectors to establish exactly what is wanted from the colleges in terms of training, and then and for them to reach a particular benchmark, so that the sectors have faith in the output of those colleges. So there's a direct interest the City Hall plays in both the encouragement of good training standards and apprenticeships, and the promotion of apprenticeships. And you've heard Michelle say about a big campaign that has just been launched to promote these across London.
It's probably also worth saying that we're doing a huge amount of work with the DWP and JCP in London, and it's been a really positive relationship over the last 2 years, probably prompted by the pandemic and the need to really support our young people in particular. And part of the Mayor's Academies programme, again, is starting to join those things through, making sure that our Job Centre Plus advisors know of the opportunities are there, making sure that our hubs are linking in with those people that we know are unemployed or at risk, and starting to link all of these things together. So there is a lot of action. I suppose what we're saying is the things that you suggested there is exactly what the programmes we're working on at the moment, and the relationships with colleagues across DWP aiming to achieve. And I think a big part of that is also the campaign, letting people know that there are careers. This is how you start to access them. The Mayor also launched on Monday a map of training providers on the GLA website. The campaign links through to that, tells you what those providers are able to support people with, so it's another route in.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just, we've heard a bit about how the Mayor is sort of, we always hear, it feels to me, how the Mayor is powerless. I'm just noting on his 2016 manifesto, he made a pledge to create thousands of new high-quality apprenticeships. And I think when I checked last year, the actual number 5 years in was 375, which is obviously not thousands.
Sorry, Chair, I'm having a bit of difficulty this end.
Sorry, I do apologise. So in his 2016 manifesto, the Mayor said that he would create thousands of new high-quality apprenticeships. But when I checked last year, the number stood at about 375. So I'm just wondering, you know, in light of what we're hearing about how the Mayor's powers are limited, you know, was the 2016 promise, was that a realistic promise, or was that a sort of manifesto promise? I should say it was a written manifesto promise, not a Twitter manifesto promise. I know that has come up previously.
So I can come in on some of that. So I think we were, unfortunately, really affected by the start of the pandemic, literally at the point that we went
Sorry, the pandemic started in March 2020.
Yeah, so we had been working on a series of programmes, I was just going to come on to that, which we were literally about to launch. One of the things we had got up and running is the London Progression Programme, which was obviously done a fantastic job, but I think probably would have done far more had we not been in a pandemic situation. We also had 2 programmes that we were about to launch, which we'd actually got virtually into contract at that point. However, unfortunately, getting people into work and into apprenticeship places was virtually impossible during that first year. So we reviewed all of that and looked at how could we repurpose that funding to support the recovery programme. So that is a direct reason why some of our numbers are much lower.
Okay, I mean, those are all things he's doing in his second term, and that was a first-term promise, and he got 5 years of first term. But anyway, what I was just going to say, and I'll say this now to myself as well, I know colleagues have many additional questions they want to ask, and I appreciate that our guests wish to speak at length about what the issues they're very knowledgeable about. And I particularly bear in mind that in the early questions, people perhaps have particular points they want to get out. What I will say, since I take a mathematical approach to these things, we're currently on track to finish at about 20 to 2. So if I could politely encourage colleagues to be prompt with their questions and guests to be prompt with their answers, because what I don't want to have to do in practice is start to truncate people's questions later on or miss out areas which, just because it's later in the agenda, is therefore less important. So if we could just bear that in mind. And with that, Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning. Thank you for coming to the Economy Committee. Stephen, if I can begin with you. We've been touching on this all morning, but I just want to head on it directly, which is about perceptions of apprenticeships. Do you still think that there is a barrier to people accessing them because they're seen in some ways wrongly as inferior to more academic routes? And if so, I can see you nodding. What can the Mayor do about that and other bodies?
Yes, and I would take the Chair's prompt for pithiness there as well. So, I mean, yes, our research definitely shows, first of all, a lack of awareness in lots of groups about the existence of apprenticeships. Some of the best apprentices I've met, I've asked them, how do you get into it? And it's kind of been an accident, and we need to make it a bit more systematic. So there's definitely that. Then there are perceptions sometimes. I think that is changing, to be fair, and particularly with the growth of higher apprenticeships as well. But also the advice that you get, whether it's in school or in college, you know, sometimes can, you know, Simon was talking about the Baker Clause earlier, which is trying to get more neutral careers advice into education settings. So I think there's some of that there as well. So there's definitely a perception and awareness point issue, but some of that's changing a bit. What can the Mayor do? Well, I think it's partly about using the profile that the Mayor's got and the relationships he's got with business and through local authorities as well to raise awareness. It's partly through the Mayor's office and the GLA being leaders in this, and you know, doing lots of things around employing apprentices directly in a range of roles. I'm sure Jules and Michelle have probably got lots of examples that they'll give on this. But also, I think about the joining up point, so that whichever bit of the employment and skills system you access, because it's very complicated, whichever bit you access, somebody's going to be telling you about the apprenticeship opportunities and how great they are and how you get into them. I think that's really critical.
Thank you very much for that. Turning to the Deputy Mayor, it'd be remiss of me at this point not to say that we don't often talk about our staff as Assembly members, but one of my staff members, Stephen, who prepared my briefing today, was an apprentice in the GLA scheme, is now a fantastic member of staff. So I think that's an example where this really works. Would you agree, though, that there is still a barrier where it's sometimes seen as a lesser thing to going to university, for instance? And what are you doing about that, and what can we do more to tackle that?
Yeah, unfortunately, that is the case, and it's something that we have always spoken about whenever we've had the opportunity on platforms, and I did again this morning to the AALP conference, and there were a lot of nods in the room that I could see on my screen about the need, in particular, to educate parents as much as those the people that we'd like to become apprentices. You know, there is a a bit of a 1950s view about the nature of some of the roles as well, so such as construction, and these are out of date, and we need to move them on. So we need to improve the awareness of apprenticeships, the quality of what exists now, and the standard and breadth of careers that go on from those. Both Stephen and Simon are absolutely right about excising the Baker Clause. The trouble is this government has excised it in the current bill. So rather than enforcing it, it looks like we'll be back to square one in terms of being able to do that. It'll all be back to soft power rather than saying, no, this is actually a standard that we have to meet in delivering fair, impartial advice across the board to young people. I mean, what we've been saying again and again for the last 5 years, 6 years, about the importance of good quality advice and guidance. It's always been a bit of a Cinderella service, whatever it's called, whatever the funding model is over the last 20, 30 years. We'd be keen to see, and always have been, to see something devolved to the MCAs and have it more locally tailored. We haven't just been lobbying for that, though. Meanwhile, we've been had the Enterprise Advisor Network, where every school who wanted one could have an advisor visit. We've launched the Careers Hubs initiative, which expands that Enterprise Advisor network, some £11 million the Mayor's spending on that. Michelle's mentioned the No Wrong Door initiative. All these will be about part of it will be about promoting good quality apprenticeships as a route for young people.
Thank you for that, Deputy Mayor, and I very much amplify your point about devolution and the need for soft power around apprenticeships. Obviously, though, it's not just soft power. At the moment, apprentices are often paid £4.30 an hour. Now, London is an incredibly expensive city to live in, and so many people can't live on £4.30 an hour, particularly if you're from a disadvantaged background. This is just impossible. Now, the GLA are one of the good examples where they're often using a London living wage. What impact would raising the minimum apprentice wage have on apprentices?
I think it's inevitable that they would look more attractive. People would be able to practically take them as well, because sometimes they might be saying, well, actually, even though it's a terribly low wage, I'd love to take up the opportunity. That doesn't deter me into taking up the opportunity, except I practically cannot, because of the costs involved, such as the travel. The Mayor does make a contribution first year of apprenticeship. 30% of travel costs are covered through the Oyster card in the first year of apprenticeship. But obviously there are other costs, having to eat out at lunch and things like that. Maybe particular clothing that you need, even if it's just to look smart. There are costs in going to work. And they need to be recognised, as you have recognised. The GLA tops up to its own to at least a London living wage. The Mayor, through his good work standards, encourages employers to do the same. It's one of the standards expected if you're going to get the good work mark. I think the government needs to look again at the apprenticeship rate.
Thank you. And finally, something I've been pushing the Mayor on, separate to apprenticeships, is a universal basic income. Now, the difference this could make to apprentices, I think, is quite clear, that if every person had a set amount of money that they could have for food, security, rent, etc., could mean, I think, there would be a lot more access to apprenticeships because they wouldn't have to worry about paying the rent. Do you have any comments on that?
I always read articles proposing it and articles covering experiments around the world in it with great interest, but I'm not probably qualified to speak on behalf of anybody, let alone the Mayor, as to the likelihood or practicalities of implementing it.
I'm going to slowly tempt you all into it. Simon, just finally, would you have anything to add particularly about the London living wage around disadvantaged Londoners and having more access to apprenticeships?
Yeah, I mean, apprenticeships have always been about individuals, the government and employers investing together. So part of the deal in most countries around the world is you get a slightly lower wage, but you're getting training and this will pay off in the longer run. That said, I think there are particular issues around the level of the apprentice minimum wage, and particularly in London as well. So we've argued for it to be raised up to the age-related rates. It also adds to the complication of the minimum wage system. So I mentioned earlier that 1 in 5 apprentices reports being illegally low paid, which is a shocking statistic, and I feel people should be a bit more outraged about it and do something about it. But we talked to employers about where's this cropping up, and lots of employers didn't understand. You may say they should, but they didn't understand that when you've done your apprenticeship for a year, you're then onto the age-related rate, and people change ages during the course of this, they go on to different. So there's a complication point. I would also argue that whether it's the mayor, I recognise the mayor's got limited resources, but whether it's the mayor or the government, those extra costs that people face, particularly if they're from more disadvantaged backgrounds, we need to help them to cover, otherwise it's inaccessible.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Sheikh.
Thanks very much, Chair, and welcome to the panel. Good to be discussing this important issue with you all this morning. I couldn't agree more about the conversation we've just had around raising the wages for apprentices in order to make it more accessible. And I think my colleague, Assemblymember Harani, will be following up with some questions on that. But I just wanted to revisit the point slightly about barriers to apprenticeships, whether that's perceptions or otherwise. And wanted to ask, maybe starting off with Michelle and Jules, if that's all right. Obviously, we know that the Mayor does a lot to tackle stereotypes, not just in apprenticeships, but in all aspects of the GLA family, in terms of encouraging diversity in his mayoral academies. But specifically, for instance, like gender stereotypes, what is being done to, I guess, manage the perceptions, for instance, particularly in the construction industry, and in order to encourage a kind of a bigger and diverse pool. So if I start off with either Michelle or Jules, and then maybe on to Stephen.
Tackling the imbalance in participants in different sectors has been a priority for the Mayor. That can be shown in the Construction Academy, the Mayor's first academy system that set targets for Black and minority ethnic participants and women participants in those courses, and similarly we have similar targets within the new academies program across all the all the additional sectors that we've introduced. Plus, obviously, the Mayor has the WIN program as well. Specifically targeted on increasing Black and minority ethnic participation in a wide range of sectors, but notably construction. Michelle?
Yeah, I was just going to say the WIN is also working. I suppose the difference between the Mayor's Construction Academy, where we had specific targets for BAME Londoners or women, moving forward into the Mayor Academies programme, what we're also offering is that support for employers to help diversify their workforce. So recognising that each of the mayoral academy sectors have quite different challenges. You may look at hospitality and think, well, actually, that's a relatively diverse sector, it brings in different types of individuals. Something like green construction is still very focused, it's predominantly men, it's predominantly white men. So the Workforce Integration Network would be working with those employers and providing them with bespoke support to help them to tackle the barriers for people entering into their sectors or even knowing about their sectors, and then also looking at some of the challenges that they as employers may have in terms of the culture of their organisations. So we do, through the Mayor's Academy programme, now offer that level of support, and that will be rolling out with the programme.
That's great, thank you. I mean, before I come on to Stephen, I just wanted to pick up on some of the things that you both mentioned. I'll start off with you, Michelle, in terms of also offering that support to employers. And you used hospitality as an example of a sector that already has great diversity, and I totally agree with you. But one of the questions I asked the Mayor, which I think feels pertinent to bring out, although not completely relevant to apprenticeships, but perhaps speaks to the wider culture of inaccessibility, is sexual harassment in the workplace in the hospitality sector. 9 out of 10 people who work in the hospitality sector have experienced sexual harassment, which is wild because it's essentially everyone if you whittle that figure down. So I think, and that's actually regardless of gender, but I think it certainly feeds into a culture about how hostile or how safe a workplace is. And I think that those ripples are probably relatable to perhaps, like we were saying, with the construction industry and women. So good to hear about the support for the employers. A little bit more detail on that would be fantastic. And then also just specifically on the targets that have been set for BAME people and women in the construction academy and whether they've been met.
So in the existing MES Construction Academy, we haven't met our gender targets. That's primarily because we set a very stretching target. I want to say, I can't remember the exact target we set, but we can share that with you afterwards. It was a stretch target. We did think it was going to be a challenge. We have done well, I think, but we haven't hit that target. What I would say, though, is across some of the other training that we provide, the numbers of women going into any of those sectors are actually higher. So there is something about people undertaking training in those sectors and then still not necessarily transferring into roles within those sectors. And that's certainly something we want to tackle through the Mayor's Academies programme and some of the other work that we're doing as well.
Cool. Well, I think it's good that we've aimed high in terms of setting those targets at an aspiration that encourages as much of it as possible. And I think more than knowing the specific target, it'd be good to know what's being learnt to ensure that next time we do achieve it. Stephen, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add.
Yeah, just a couple of things, if I may. I think one of the challenges with anything relating to labour markets is that anyone you can talk to is able to list about 50 different initiatives on any particular topic, and actually that's kind of really complicated and it is sometimes confusing for people and for employers. So I think there is a simplicity point a little bit here. There's also making sure that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So, my measure of success would be, are apprenticeships in London doing better than the average? Are they growing faster than the UK average, England average? And does the diversity better reflect London's population? So there's those kind of macro measures, and as well as independently evaluating each of those individual measures, I say with a degree of self-interest as an organisation that does evaluate things. But I'll just make two other really quick points. So the first is about role models, which I think is really important here. So for the last 30 years, we've been running our Festival of Learning Awards, which are awards for adult learners. And we've got some brilliant examples and award winners of women working in construction, for example, to take, because you mentioned that. So I think those role models are really important, so everyone can see this can be the job for me, this can be the sector for me. So I think anything more we can do on that would be great. The other point is how you sort of tilt the system to make sure that it's fair and that it's trying to get take-up that matches the population. So one way to do that is to set targets for individual programmes to say, well, the take-up of this programme should be 50% women, 50% men, for example. And then if you don't do that, well, what's happened, what's gone wrong and what's gone right? But also, we argued for some funding incentives as well. So we argued for an Apprentice Premium, a bit like the pupil premium, so that you can then tailor that around whether it's gender or ethnicity, or I wanted to mention social class as well. Yes. We know that I think this is evidence outside London, but we know that young people who are on free school meals are far less likely to get level 3 apprenticeships, which really can help you sort of kick on, than young people not on free school meals. So I think there's a whole range of different inequalities that we need to be tackling there through funding, role models and targets.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen. I see Anna has got a hand up before I pass it back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief. I just wanted to share some of our data, particularly relating to the gender mix we've seen in the apprenticeships that we've created. So 63% of those have been taken by women in London. And I think when we dig down into how that splits across sectors, what we've seen is that the sectors which have perhaps been traditionally male-dominated, so construction and sort of data and technology sectors, have been attracting relatively equal numbers of male and female apprentices. So, I think we have perhaps seen the effect of some of those other projects flowing through into apprenticeships. Whereas it's the sectors which are traditionally female-dominated where we've supported a lot of apprenticeships, so social care and early years in particular, where we haven't seen the kind of the strides in terms of a more equal gender balance that we might want, which clearly has, strong relationships with wages in those sectors and some of the other factors kind of more widely in the economy. So I think it's interesting to dig down a little deeper than the overall numbers and see what's happening in different sectors.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more, Anna. Thank you for that. And at some point, Chair, it'd be really great to just pick back up that point that Stephen made about children on free school meals traditionally don't go beyond level 3 of the apprenticeships. I'm just trying to unpack a little bit more about why, but I can appreciate that it might come out naturally later on.
Okay, so we now move to Assemblymember Harani, who is joining us remotely. Hopefully.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me. Really fascinating to hear the answers so far to some of the questioning. I just want to come into maybe one of the issues that we haven't covered and talk about sort of overlapping and perhaps conflicting schemes, because over the pandemic we saw the introduction of the Kickstart Program, which funded and supported 6-month placements for young people, but according to reports, it doesn't seem to be going too well. I know they've closed applications at the moment, and there's little prospect of full-time jobs after it. How does this scheme compare, or how is it compatible with apprenticeships? I think I'll ask Jules that one.
The Kickstart scheme. I mean, obviously the additional money into the system is welcome, but as I think Stephen alluded to, it wasn't particularly successful at its introduction, not least from our perspective that it was introduced so late in the year. It was introduced in April, when that's not necessarily a particularly fertile time for colleges to recruit. Also, the government rules at the time, which are only changing this coming April, were that level 3 qualification, to do a level 3 qualification, you couldn't if you already had a level 3 or higher qualification. The Mayor changed that for his funding, for his courses, a couple of years ago, and we saw a leap in the number of people taking advantage of that. The government's taken a leaf out of that book, and as from this coming April, you will be able to take a level 3 course even if you already have one, which is great for people who have, trained in something, had a job for a number of years. As a result, whether it's the pandemic, whatever, Brexit, new technology, whatever it's brought about, if you need to pivot and change. Right. Okay. Then you're able to do that. So actually, I think we could be talking across purposes on the funding here. Actually, sorry. Actually, if I hand over to Michelle.
So I think just to clarify, the question was around Kickstart and then the compatibility with apprenticeships. Is that right? Okay. I don't know, Jules, do you want to...
Yeah, go on. You go.
Okay, so we'll pick that up. We had a good conversation about level 3 there, though. So the Kickstart programme, I think, has, as everybody here has said, has had a number of challenges. I have to say, I am not an expert on Kickstart, and I know Stephen probably is far better at answering this question than me, but I think there is an issue around the eligibility around Kickstart, in the sense that you could be quite highly qualified, but not be, in employment, and it is about getting those young people back in. I think one thing I'd say before handing over to Stephen, who can probably explain the detail around that much more, is that one of the roles that the Mayor has is about trying to join all of these things up, because there are a plethora of different initiatives. We've mentioned, for example, boot camps this morning. That's another thing that's just about to land with us, and that's also about doing some kind of short, sharp intervention to get somebody a guaranteed job interview at the end of that. So part of the role the Mayor really has is trying to join all those things together, and I think what we have been fairly successful in the Mayor's Academy programme shows that, is that whilst it's a £44 million programme that the Mayor's investing in, that £44 million is made up of various different funding streams that we've been able to pull together into a coherent programme to help Londoners understand, or access all of these things without them needing to understand the different funding streams that may or may not be involved in that. But I'll hand over to Stephen for the example.
Yeah, so perhaps if I come in now, if that's okay. So I think I was really pleased when the Chancellor announced Kickstart as part of the Plan for Jobs. I think it's a really good idea, really necessary, and that's probably worth saying right at the start. And I think it is, or could have been, compatible more compatible with apprenticeships. We talked a little bit, as Jules mentioned, about some of the practical aspects of delivery and sort of a few things getting lost within the DWP, but I think that they're meant to be aimed at two different groups. So Kickstart is meant to be there for people, young people at risk of long-term unemployment. And apprenticeships, I think, should be something when people are getting towards the end of their Kickstart job that they go on to. So I think we're aiming at two different groups of young people, but I think one of the challenges is with a particular budget that the DPP had, you then end up trying to chase some of the numbers because that's inevitable, because somebody will ask them what's the take up and if you hit the targets, and we've lost sight a little bit of what we're trying to do. We're trying to limit long-term unemployment for young people and help them kick on in their career and build their skills. So I think Kickstart's a really good idea. There's some brilliant examples actually out there, and then some problems with delivery that we talked about before. The way I would have made it more compatible with the apprenticeship system is to have a proper incentive and target and measure in there for how many young people doing Kickstart placements go on to apprenticeships. And actually, could you convert it part way through as well? You don't have to necessarily do the full 6 months. Why couldn't you then convert it onto an apprenticeship as well? So I think there's a few missed tricks there and a few bits of joining up the system that we could have done better.
Thanks for that. That was really, really helpful. I think maybe is any of that being captured, and maybe some of these recommendations being sent back to government in terms of what can be done to make the system work better and make different pathways flow better. Michelle, I was really interested in kind of your comments around, I mean, for the young person, it can be quite confusing having all these different schemes and all these different opportunities, but it sounds like you're trying to channel it into one system where then it's yourselves that then allocate, or it's yourselves that then lead that young person through the pathway on which option is best for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things we're really trying to do through both the Mayor's Academies programme, but also through the No Wrong Door initiative. But I think we also need to be really careful about not underestimating the challenge of doing this. So as Stephen mentioned earlier, there are multiple different programmes trying to support young people. The No Wrong Door actually started as a slight joke in the sense when we were starting to do that in terms of the title, because we've been talking about a No Wrong Door for Londoners for as long as I've been in this area, and trying to make sure that wherever Londoners seek their advice from, they're getting the same information, and they don't need to be worried about the different funding streams that they may or may not be eligible for. So we're now really trying to put that into practice through the Mayor's investment and working with our local authority partners to really make sure we're doing that. But it is a huge challenge, and one that I know everybody around this table is working really hard to achieve. We've tried for a very long time. Hopefully we will get there with this.
Great. And the issue of wages and low pay for younger workers has already been mentioned, whether it's the national living wage or the apprenticeship income levels that are given to young people as a result of being part of these schemes. I understand the Deputy Mayor mentioned earlier about how through city halls or GLA group schemes that the London living wage is very much at the forefront of your thoughts. But what is the Mayor doing to encourage employers to pay apprenticeship at the London living wage rate and sign up also to the Good Work Standard?
Your second question really kind of answers the first. Really, you know, it is part of the Good Work Standard. It is a criteria that the Mayor would expect that is established, or that they're working towards, seriously working towards, to be able to say one's adopted the Mayor's Good Work Standard, and it is heavily promoted by the Mayor to business groups and the sectors across London. It is part and parcel of what we discuss when, you know, with our expectations of employers.
I think just to add to that, the Mayor's Anchors programme as well is another sort of initiative. Well, it's not an initiative, it's a sort of scheme that we're working with various different partners from across London, those anchor institutions, to encourage them as well to work towards the Good Work Standard. Certainly they've been paying the living wage. We're also looking, or the Mayor through his responsible procurement programme, about embedding some of this within the procurement activity that we have. certainly in my area, we announced the skills roadmap on Monday, and that has a clear commitment that we expect all of those colleges, training providers and other providers of services to be working towards the Mayor's Good Work standard to encourage them to be paying the London living wage as well.
And the anchor institutions that Michelle mentioned, they're being specifically encouraged to make commitments to increase the number of apprenticeships that they have, that they should be at the London living wage, and to target key groups that we want to see participation increase.
Great, thank that's the end of my questioning.
Thank you very much. We now have several questions from Assemblymember Bakari, who's also joining us remotely.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm not going to cover some of the questions I had prepared earlier on younger people and ethnic minorities and economically disadvantaged Londoners who are accessing apprenticeships, because I think we've covered that. What I am interested in is two areas. What's happening to help young Londoners who are disabled? And also, we've got some really good evidence and examples from companies like the Timpsons, who have a successful track record of employing ex-offenders and reintegrating them into society. What specific actions can be taken in the apprenticeship opportunities, specifically for young offenders as well? So disabled Londoners and young offenders, what more could be done there? And I'm going to ask that to Simon and Stephen.
I think those are two really important points. I think the question on offenders is really pertinent because at the moment the government sort of funding rules doesn't allow offenders to take up an apprenticeship. However, that is something that is being actively discussed as part of the skills bill that's being debated at the moment. I know Rob Halfon, who's chair of the Education Select Committee, is pushing for a change in the legislation to allow offenders or offenders released on temporary licence to access apprenticeships to help drive employment and reduce reoffending and potentially using unspent levy. So I think there's some potential game-changing opportunities for offenders. And Michelle talked about skills boot camps which are coming soon, being opened up, eligibility around offenders. So positive, I think, kind of what the opportunities will be for offenders moving forward, but I still think there's some kind of roadblocks to sort out on those ones. Just on the disabled Londoners, I think that's, we haven't touched on that too much today. I guess one of the things I'd shine a light on that is maybe there needs to be more done in the region to promote traineeships. Traineeships is in part a pre-apprenticeship program. It's a national program at the moment, but it's obviously delivered nationally. I think the stats on traineeships, it's a program for young people 16 to 24. I think it's around 35% of young people on traineeships come from a BAME background. And I think it's around 25% of a declared learning disability or classed as disabled. I think fantastic program. I think the numbers on traineeships are still relatively small, a big government investment. So I think there could be a bit more to be done, I guess, to promote traineeship opportunities and progressions into apprenticeship, because that could tackle some of those issues that you've mentioned and also colleagues have mentioned as well.
And perhaps if I come in next, I think you were directing it to me as well. Thank you. So yeah, I agree with what Simon said, and actually the traineeship budget last year was underspent by £65 million across England, which has now been hoovered up by the Treasury. So it'd be great to see some things like that recycled into how we can help to increase access to those sort of opportunities, I think. Just a couple of things. I mean, I think around young offenders, I mean, there's the things that Simon's talked about. There's an even bigger, I feel like my theme of this morning is joining things up, and there's even more stuff to join up here, because you've also got the criminal justice system and the probation services and lots of other things and how we make apprenticeships a really key part of that, and about plans to reduce reoffending, as well as building people's life chances and their skills and their job prospects as well. So that's the kind of bigger joining up prospect point, I think. And then on disabled Londoners, I think this is a really important issue, and we know that disabled people in general of all ages were on average hit by bigger drops in their income during the pandemic, for example. And it's quite difficult to measure these things, but probably generally relatively underrepresented within the apprenticeship system. I'd come back to my point about targets and incentives, I guess. So, we should set some benchmarks. Targets probably isn't the fashionable thing these days, but set some benchmarks for fair engagement. Think about things like the Apprentice Premium that I argued for as well earlier. And then also, it used to be that you couldn't do a part-time apprenticeship. So you could work part-time, you could study part-time, but you couldn't do a part-time apprenticeship, even though an apprenticeship is a job with training. That was changed a few years ago. I think it might have actually been Robert Halfon, when he was the skills minister, I think may have changed that rule, which is great. But awareness of it is quite low, and making it happen is quite low. And then there's particular challenges within London because of travel times and costs. So we know part-time work in general is lower in London. So I would say those sort of flexible and part-time apprenticeships would be a great opportunity to increase engagement too.
I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic. I'm going to mix around my questions so that Chair understands what I'm doing right now, but I'm going to just go to that specific area of the pandemic that you just mentioned. And you have talked about it earlier as well, and the impact that it's had. There's a lot to learn from the pandemic as well, and a hybrid approach is like, as I am here right now talking to you from home. There's lots that we could do to adjust the way you just mentioned, the flexibility. So what potential is there of having a different approach, like a hybrid approach in the apprenticeship system? And I'll go to both of you again, Stephen and Simon.
Yeah, I think there's lots we can learn in delivery of public services, in how we all work. As you say, this is a hybrid meeting, for example. And then also what education and training programs look like. So, for example, we do an annual survey of adults participating in learning to find out whether they do and why they do and why they don't. And what we saw during the pandemic was a real spike in interest in learning, and particularly self-directed and particularly online as well. So there's lots of interest, and it opens up new opportunities, given that the biggest barrier people cite to not taking part in learning is that, or one of the biggest barriers is fitting it around work and home life. And actually technology and flexible working and flexible learning allows us to do that. So I feel like there's a lot of lessons for us all to learn as employers, as organisations, but also in how we set up the education and training systems to make the most of this. And there's loads of great learnings. And I think in terms of the role of the education department, but also the mayor, I think it's sort of bringing those together and then building that into commissioning, building that into delivery, spreading the best practice as well. Loads of people are doing stuff that lots of other people don't know about. So I think there is a sort of awareness point here as well.
Just kind of picking on Stephen's point, we've seen a move to a much more blended approach to training and assessment, remote invigilation, individuals being based at home. So I think there's definitely some learnings to be had from that, but it's also worth recognising that blended learning, remote learning doesn't always work for all learners. Ofsted did some analysis on that, and everyone worked in a best spirit during the pandemic to keep learners learning, but ultimately some learners didn't learn at the pace that they would do normally, and they didn't necessarily engage with learners. So it is getting the right blended approach. And there's also challenges, certainly in the apprenticeship space, around the digital divide. We know there are a number of learners who had access issues around connectivity and devices, and the kind of government's assumption, I guess, that because they're employed, the employer would pay for them. So there's still a challenge around those on low income and accessibility. And then I guess just move on to portable apprenticeships. So we're expecting a change in the legislation in April, which will allow individuals to work on project-based employment episodes. So still the requirement that adding those together, they meet the minimum duration of the apprenticeship, so at least 12 months long and with 20% off the job. But these are some of the flexibilities, I guess, that the government is starting to introduce and pilot. There's still some things to iron out around, success rate measures and eroded learning and the bureaucracy that goes behind it. So again, these are kind of good initiatives to encourage participation from individuals who otherwise be ineligible for an apprenticeship, or they work in an environment that wouldn't allow them to meet the minimum requirements. So they're the kind of evolutionary things that we're certainly seeing in the apprenticeship space to widen participation, which are starting to roll out a bit more widespread this year onwards, I guess, and certainly portable apprenticeships is going to be one of those.
Brilliant, thank you. I do want to talk a little bit about this promotion aspect of the apprenticeships, and particularly when it comes to schools and colleges and in their role as doing career advice and enabling young people to access apprenticeships. What needs to be done to reflect the ongoing changes to the labour market within the career advice that Londoners are receiving at the moment? And that's again to Simon and to Stephen.
I think I touched on at the start that there's still some challenge around making sure that schools are complying with the legislation around just giving pupils impartial advice around what the options are. So not necessarily cherry picking individuals. So I think it has to go back a level from what you're suggesting in terms of keeping the labour market information up to date. I still think there's a more fundamental issue around accessibility, which is the crucial aspect to address initially. We talked about enforcement of the Baker Clause. One of the things that's been discussed is, should Ofsted have a limiting grade that if schools aren't complying with, giving independent careers advice and guidance, and then kind of building on what you were suggesting, making sure that information is relevant and correct. They're some of the things that are being discussed at the moment. I mean, one of the other things that we've not really touched on is, that's very much, with a carrot and a stick approach. One of the things that might help schools become more impartial and drive that agenda might be things like, considering how apprenticeships could fit in performance tables and how that fits in with academic routes. So, thinking about how we can encourage behaviour around incentives and also penalising those who don't follow the approach as well.
And I think to add to that, I mean, I think it's thinking about where do young people and adults get their advice from, and it's family, it's friends, it's online, it's through their own experiences. It's kind of sometimes through formal careers advice services as well. But it's getting at that range of networks and contacts with people and making sure there's good quality advice and good quality data as well. Kind of what apprenticeships are out there. How do I apply for one, and what am I likely to earn if I do it? It's that sort of thing, but in the context of lots of other options as well. And I guess the other point I'd make is, Michelle talked earlier about the Mayor's No Wrong Doors initiative. You've also got to get people to come to the door in the first place, and lots of people just aren't spontaneously going to turn up for some careers advice. So, it's how do you inspire that engagement in the first place? So, very quick example, just quick sentence. So, we did a pilot a few years ago with career reviews for people around and about the age of 50-ish. We deliberately didn't define it too tightly. And what we found was people were really interested. It surprised anyone wanted to talk to them about their career or their life or their skills. Really interested in it, and actually really good stuff delivered through union learning reps, through housing associations, through councils, through lots of other sources, as well as things like the National Career Service. So I think about those wider networks and how we get out to people to get them into the door, which hopefully is not the wrong one.
I'm just going to finish off talking about people who are over 25, and there has been some success there when it comes to apprenticeships. But what's interesting is the actual skills, and I think both Simon and Stephen have talked about that and about the concern they have of the type of skills that are being upskilled and the kind of retraining that people over 25 are experiencing, and also impacting on like I mentioned before about the pandemic. A lot of these people may have had jobs before, they've been experiencing furlough, they've been made redundant. There's a lot of experiences and that over 25-year-olds have been going through. How do you think the apprenticeships have been used to help that specific area and that specific group?
Shall I start? This is one of my many hobby horses, I'm afraid. But I mean, I think this comes back to an earlier point, really. So we definitely need more training for people already in the workforce. 80% of our 2030 workforce have already left full-time education. So we definitely need training at work and training for people over the age of 25. We definitely need training for people at higher levels as well. So we know that one of the things that holds back productivity in the UK is relatively poor management skills. So we need more management and leadership. The question is, does it really have to always be an apprenticeship? You know, there's more to life than apprenticeships is my earlier slightly heretical point. So we need a much broader approach, I think, to these things. Not everything has to be an apprenticeship. I guess the other point here is that people from lots of other countries would look at our apprenticeship system slightly confusedly, because in most other countries, apprenticeships are for young people starting their career and they're at level 3, effectively, and we've kind of turned it into all training for all people. So I think there is kind of some Brandon, are we stretching these things? Do we need other stuff in there points? But the last point I'll perhaps make is a lot of those over 25s, as you said, are people in their current jobs who are now becoming apprentices. And actually, I think there's a real gap here for over 25s in particular in terms of retraining and career switching, which we know we're going to see more of full stop. Pandemic's probably accelerated some of it as well. And the offer for retrainers is really, really poor in this country. So some of that is about being able to retrain at level 3, as I think Jules was talking about earlier, but it's also about how does the apprenticeship system support career switchers and those people who are being displaced through the pandemic as well. That's a real gap that we can do better on, I think.
Thank you.
Just really to reinforce what Stephen said, that there's a lot more than just apprenticeships. We've got skills boot camps. Jules talked about the level 3 entitlement. We've got the lifelong loan entitlement coming as well. I mean, the only point I would really stress, I guess, is that there's nothing wrong with adult apprenticeships, which make up 50% of the starts. We clearly want to see more young people into the workforce, but employers are acting in the spirit. It's their levy, it's their workforce, but so we've just got to be careful that we don't disincentivize whilst we're trying to incentivize as well. So, but also recognizing, as Stephen said, there's a range of programs which are a lot shorter and snappier than necessarily a 12-month apprenticeship with 20% off the job, which might not necessarily be right for all those adults over 25 that you've referenced.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all those answers. I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much. I thought there was a particularly interesting bit actually about the upskilling and the retraining. I think sometimes people can feel stuck in a job, and so knowing that there are ways to either move on within their current industry or switch entirely, I think that's a very important part of this. We have 2 very quick questions, which I'm certain will also garner very succinct answers just to finish off this section. First of all, from Assemblymember Polanski.
I'll be very brief. It's just around this idea of getting people to push on know wrong doors and know where the doors are. Now, Disability Rights UK have been doing amazing work around apprenticeships, charity work, particularly with 18 to 24-year-olds, and we've just discussed there about making sure there's access for over 25-year-olds. What happens with access at the intersection where you're both disabled and you're over 25? What more work are there to be doing for that group of people?
Yes, I think this is where, in a complex system, we end up setting lots of eligibility rules for this, that, and the other, and they often collide unhelpfully for people. And actually, we need to start from the point of view of what does the individual need and how can we get it to them, rather than thinking, well, you don't quite fit into that box and you're in a bit of that box. And so I think it's partly about flexibility, actually, in some of the rules, particularly where it then leads to a clear plan that's going to deliver for that person as well, or deliver an apprenticeship or whatever it happens to be. So I'd argue for a bit more flexibility in joining up around the individual rather than thinking about lots of siloed programs left, right and centre.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. And another short question from Assemblymember Ahmad.
Thank you very much. Going back to... Can we hear? Are we hearing? Thank you. Going back to the careers service question. So I have every sympathy after 2010 when the Lib Dem and Conservative coalition government cut the careers service and the effect that it had on those service personal, and of course on the young people who were adversely affected by that. Having had two young people growing up in my own household who couldn't access the information they needed. The question I'm asking,
sorry, I'm not interrupting you about your political grandstanding, which you're welcome to do. You have your phone leaned on the microphone. I'm sorry, Assemblymember Ahmad. I'm trying to chair this meeting.
Is that helping? Is that helping?
Well, your microphone was crackly, and I did ask you to move away.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You may continue with your question.
And to the tech team for that. So the 2011 Education Act, where these cuts came into being by the then coalition government, put the responsibilities on schools for career guidance. What impact did this decision by the then government have on young people and apprenticeships? And how is the Mayor filling the gap in this provision? And my question, again, is to Simon and Stephen. So, Stephen, perhaps you'd like to start?
Well, I'm not a complete expert on the precise impact of those specific changes, but I'd make a couple of general points related to that, if I may. It's definitely the case that we need to really increase the number of careers opportunities people get. So where's that advice coming from? And it shouldn't just be about schools, in my personal opinion. So thinking about those networks. And also, the technology's moved on as well. So how can people access some of these things online? I think you risk getting some perverse incentives if you rely on one institution to give the careers advice, because as neutral as they want to be, they're going to come from a particular set of perspectives. So that's the point about the Baker Clause to an extent, is how do we make sure that young people get advice on all the options, not just the ones that institution knows most about. So I'd probably say that, I can't really speak to the things the Mayor's doing on those things. That's probably one for perhaps Michelle or Jules.
Okay, perhaps we could get to that. Simon, did you want to say anything more?
I kind of agree with your point that, back in 2010 with the sort of end of connections, that was fairly catastrophic for young people in terms of, one-stop shop to give them really good advice and guidance. We saw a lot of that rolled into the National Careers Service, which tends to be more focused on adults. I mean, I guess I'd sort of signpost the role of the Careers Enterprise Company. That's kind of taken on that mantle to some extent. That's been a journey, I guess, and some of that is still a little bit piecemeal, a bit fragmented. We've got some good initiatives out there. We've got Ask, Apprenticeship, Knowledge in Schools. So there's pockets of really good initiatives, but it's probably a bit too piecemeal, a bit fragmented. And it was interesting, kind of what colleagues are suggesting around, should there be more devolution of careers advice to give the region, more of a joined-up approach, and that's probably something I would suggest is worth pursuing.
That's very interesting. Thank you. And did Jules or Michelle, would you like to pick up on those issues?
Just briefly, I've mentioned the LEAN, the Enterprise Advisor Network. It is something of a sticking plaster, though, for a fully fledged, fully funded system that this country has had a history, as we've heard, over the last many decades of chopping and changing where careers advice comes from, who's responsible for it, how it's funded, which government department funds it, the structure of it, the name of it, the location of it, local authorities in, out, and we're reaping the disbenefits of that now. Things like the LEAN are where the Mayor's tried to intervene as much as his powers and funding allow. If we're look at it honestly, enterprise advisor networks are volunteers. They are business volunteers. The money the Mayor puts in is to enable the coordination of it. Then we've got the hubs. That's £11 million that we're putting into the hubs. That is a more organised and comprehensive approach. Speaks a lot to what we've been talking about today about join up. It is all about join up. That's what the academy is essentially is doing. It's not a physical building to replicate what other people are doing and to do in parallel. It's about joining up what is there to make it work better. So the hubs are designed to do that and complement and expand the LEAN work. But crucially, that £11 million comes from ESF. It's European money. So when that runs out, then
Or
what?
do we have
We
anything?
don't. I mean, the GLA doesn't have the money to replace that 11 million pounds.
And,
So
and
it's
d-
funded
so,
until.
and Jules,
Sorry,
are
I'm
we
just going
aware
to
of?
look at Michelle to when it's
Yeah.
funded.
Sorry, it's
till.
funded till 2023. So I suppose we're looking for, on the back of the Levelling Up announcements yesterday, where the UK Share Prosperity Fund gets awarded, and if we would be able to use that.
The
Okay.
scary thing is if the UK Prosperity Fund, rather than being divided along rules that we're familiar with, if it's directed by what we're seeing, in an ad hoc way we see money dispersed across the country, or even if it's the levelling up approach, which could still see London disadvantaged, then I'm not sure how we would continue funding the hubs beyond 2023.
Watching brief. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I believe we have a question from Assemblymember Harani, which is going to be quick, and if I could ask there to be no further supplementaries to that question and quite brief answers from our guests, otherwise people are not going to be able to ask other questions later on. Assemblymember Harani.
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to this issue on retraining, which was picked up, I think, towards the end of the questioning. And it's just in relation to ESOL, which has obviously been cut by 40% since 2010, meaning that many Londoners with an ethnic minority background may struggle to access opportunities to further their career. In 2019, the Mayor extended eligibility for adult education budget-funded courses to learners in low-paid work, unlocking some of those opportunities to access ESOL for nearly 40,000 Londoners. Actually, it's what I'll probably see as is plugging a gap based on the cuts that we've experienced in 2010. We obviously want all those that need ESOL classes to access them. So this one's probably for Jules and Michelle. How can the Mayor and also how can government achieve this?
Sorry, achieve?
Unlocking the opportunities of ESOL classes.
Well, we are working closely with sector organisations on how to promote this. We are looking at a website that the sector specifically asked for. It was their main ask, I think, in order to also in multilingual as well website to enable potential learners to know exactly where the courses are, where they can find out information. I need not repeat the impact that you've mentioned, that changing eligibility criteria and the criteria around wage levels to be able to be fully funded as well, and that's had a very positive impact.
Just linked to that, some of the changes the Mayor has made around eligibility around asylum seekers, refugees, and those people who are as partners of British citizens who are from the EU, allowing them to access funding has also enabled that. We do deliver the most ESOL in the country, and it's something that we're very conscious of. But funding cuts have obviously curtailed our ability to deliver as much as we possibly would like.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Yes. So I have a couple of questions now to Anna, if I may, about sort of London progression collaboration. Really, have you met? Has it met its initial targets? What were those targets? So what's the progress been of the progression collaboration?
Thank you, Chair. So we have created now about 725 new apprenticeships since the pilot began, all at levels 2 to 4. Since our launch in February 2020, in the midst of the global pandemic, and have secured over £9 million in unspent apprenticeship levy funds from large businesses for transfer to small businesses. Our original target for the initiative set before the pandemic was to create just over 1,000 new apprenticeships for Londoners. We've obviously not quite met that. We believe we're on track to meet that over the course of the spring, and we've been grateful for some extensions from our partners and funders to allow us to do that. But I think we've been pleased by what we have been able to achieve at a time when obviously nationally we've seen apprenticeship creation fall quite significantly, and particularly that those apprenticeships that we've created have been at levels and targeting the individuals who have seen the greatest hit from those numbers falling.
yes, it's been a difficult time for recruiting and apprentices across the board in all sectors, hasn't it? Really, it's not been an easy time. So what's the sort of next step for the progression collaboration?
So we believe that we've achieved kind of proof of concept of our original innovation, that independent business support can enable small businesses to create new apprenticeships and to reach those groups that might otherwise be missing out. Our interim evaluation from Learning and Work Institute last February helped to give us some evidence towards that, and we're just awaiting our final evaluation of the initial pilot period now. We've been grateful, as I said, to secure some bridge funding from our original funder, JP Morgan Chase, and to extend our arrangement with the GLA to allow us to have the kind of short-term ability to continue our work. We're in the process of securing funding mainly from trusted foundations to allow us to extend our work and have some secured and a healthy pipeline of additional opportunities at the moment. That work, as it stands, remains London-focused and is more focused on specific target beneficiary groups. Our original aim was to target low-paid Londoners, which is obviously quite a broad group. It's likely that our future funding, based on those we're talking to about that, will mean that we'll be particularly targeting those from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, and young Londoners in particular. And that also balances support for our existing work, which is very much focused around that apprenticeship creation, with support for some further innovation to look at how we can boost the progression outcomes of apprentices once they're in role by offering employers further support. And we're supporting that with further small pieces of paid work and some tender opportunities as well. And in the medium term, we're making some kind of strategic decisions about our focus and fundraising strategy based on our theory of change, which includes addressing the question of geographic focus, whether a regional focus is what can deliver the greatest impact, or whether there's a case to be made for looking beyond that. But I think, fundamentally, we believe that there is a really strong case for government and philanthropic investment in SME-focused apprenticeship creation to increase those high-quality opportunities for those who are currently at risk of missing out.
Thank you. I think the Mayor allocated, was it 350,000 to progression collaboration for 2019 to 22. Do we know yet what the Mayor's planning to allocate for the period beyond that? I don't know whether you know or whether Jules might know.
There isn't any funding available to continue it.
So
the whole idea was that it would be, as Anna has said, it was a proof of concept, and we would hope that that there would be interest in government in as I say, introducing flexibilities on the levy funding to enable it to be effectively self-funding. And when you consider what it has achieved, engaging with 200 employers and achieving the transfers that it has achieved, I think it has proved itself.
Okay, thank you very much. We have now, let me see, Assemblymember Sheikh.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a question that I think has kind of been discussed. What I'd like to do is kind of tease out some clarity and kind of summarise it, really, which is obviously we've talked about the Mayor having previously lobbied central government for the apprenticeship system to be devolved to London. So it would just be good to summarise, I guess, the ideas of what impact do we think a devolved apprenticeship system would have for London, and is the Mayor still lobbying the government to achieve this aim? So Jules and Michelle, I'll go to you for this.
Yes, we are still lobbying. I think on the most recent levelling up letter, I think, yes, we did reinsert the long list of asks. It seemed very familiar to me that we've been asking for a long, long while. I think I started on this, was it 2010, I think, probably? If
lobbying efforts.
Before that, yes, with a former hat on, the other side of the table with London councils, working with the then Mayor, I wonder where he is now, to have a devolved skills system. We were only partially successful in as much as that after, what was it, the best part of 7 or 8 years, the AEB was devolved to the mayor and to other mayoral combined authorities. So we look forward to achieving the rest of our asks devolution-wise in coming years. But the asks remain the same.
Okay, good. Good to hear about the consistency as well, and the fact that actually there has been a transition with the AEB being devolved, so it makes sense to continue on that road. What specifically has the government said in response to the mayor's efforts to lobby on this specific point?
On advice and guidance and
No,
careers
on
advice.
devolving apprenticeship system to London. What's
Sorry,
the government's response been to the mayor on the specific ask to devolve the apprenticeship system to London?
Well, is it no or silence? Silence. Silence.
Yeah.
I think in this case, silence does not mean assent.
Please, Michelle.
I was going to say, actually, whilst on apprenticeships, it has remained very quiet. And there's probably multiple reasons for that. I suppose there is some hope in some of the other funding streams coming together. So the Levelling Up White Paper yesterday, whilst it didn't have huge amounts of detail in it, it did reiterate the government's intentions around simplifying the funding systems and the role of the mayoral combined authorities and the GLA in doing that. We are expecting skills boot camps to arrive with us. In fact, we know that will be arriving with us. We put in a £19 million bid for that Friday, I think, and we're supposed to find out about that in the next week or so. And Multiply, which is the first cut of the UK Shared Prosperity Fund focusing on maths in particular, will be delivered by the devolved areas. I suppose one of the things to caution there is the Mayor is asking very much for a single pot of funding to enable us to go right back to the point Stephen was making, looking at the individual and what they require, rather than us having lots and lots of funding streams which all have different eligibility criteria. Even if we do get that, actually the ability and the role of the Mayor is knitting all of that together. And actually the Mayor's Academies programme has shown that. We've got capital funding, we've got adult education budget, we've got ESF, we've got various other GLA core funds knitted together to create a programme.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that kind of knitting together, that sort of overarching strategy is all the more reason, in my opinion, why we should have a devolved apprenticeship system in London. And you said that there might be a multiple of reasons for the silence from government. Could you expand on any of those?
That the apprenticeship system is quite complex. It is an employer levy. It comes from employers. It's for employers to spend on that one.
And I think at the end of the day, it is effectively seen as a workplace tax. It's a tax on the payroll, and there's I think a strong view about the location of where the source of taxation has been hypothecated. So. You know, if a nationwide organisation, if it's based in London, then as far as the Treasury is concerned and government, it will attribute that pot that's been created. Well, it's been generated in London, but so if they start devolving, then they're worried, I think, that it would end up advantaging the capital.
Okay, that's really helpful for that clarification. Thank you. And I'll just finish off on this final point. And again, I think it's been discussed, so it's, I suppose, about summarising and teasing it out, which is, so despite the conversation of the Mayor not having full control over the apprenticeships, how is he creating the conditions to support Londoners and businesses when creating apprenticeships or providing Londoners with the skills they need? So a lot of what Michelle has actually just talked about.
I'm really sorry, that was a bit too fast for me, sorry.
No worries. Despite the Mayor not having full control over apprenticeships in London, how is he creating the conditions to support Londoners and businesses when creating apprenticeships and providing Londoners with the skills needed? So essentially a summary of this discussion thus far, I think, is what this question is really asking.
Yes, so as not to take up the committee's time, I'd refer you back to all the different things that Michelle and I have touched upon that have been from the original start of the Skills for Londoners programme through to the most recent developments with the Academies programme.
No, that's great. Thank you. Look forward to seeing those initiatives continue to flourish. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Actually, just sorry, quickly on this question about arguing for devolved powers from government. I think am I right that that the Mayor has also asked for the Careers Service to be devolved? Does the Mayor have a sort of plan of what that would look like, or how he would do that differently if the government were to say yes?
Did you say careers?
The careers, sorry, the mayor has also, I think, asked for devolved powers over the careers advice service.
Yeah,
and I just wondered if the government were to say yes, let's imagine, what would that be? How would that be different if the mayor were in control? Does he have a plan?
Yeah, I mean, all the time I've talked about sort of advice and guidance. I mean, today it's been meaning the whole kind of careers advice and guidance service that's been such a patchwork for many years. I think the way it would look different is that it would be integrated into what we're doing at the moment.
Okay. I think we now have a question from Assemblymember Bakari.
Thank you, Chair. This question kind of relates to things that Jules and Michelle have already gone through about the Good Work for All mission and the Mayor's Skills Academy and the contribution to growing the apprenticeships in London. So I don't want to ask again to repeat what you've already said, but is there any further action that you'll be taking to support and promote apprenticeships in all parts of London during his second term? Will the Mayor of London be doing that? And additionally, as an Assembly member, and all Assembly members, we do need to scrutinise the Mayor and the role that he plays, despite the challenges. And I think Stephen said a very good point about how frustrating it is to have targets. Would there be consideration of just changing the way you use metrics so that we can determine how successful your projects are? For example, as Stephen said, use benchmarks instead. That might be maybe a different approach for us to be able to assess how successful the schemes are.
I mean, certainly on the issue of promotion of the opportunities and the availability of apprenticeships and skills and education training through the AEB, as I think Michelle and I have highlighted, it's probably the first ever, isn't it, on a London-wide on the tube network. I mean, it's I think we're slightly taking advantage of the fact of the downturn in advertising in the tube network because of recent events, and have been able to take an unprecedented amount of space to be able to promote the skills academies and the opportunities that are there in London for skills training. On the issue of benchmarks, it's something that we're always looking at and try and improve, because we want to know what works and to enable us to make the decisions that we do and the decisions the Mayor takes. The problem with benchmarks, though, is in all these things is when there are so many actors working in a particular space, how does one hypothecate the impact that you have had? It's always a challenge. That's not meant to say for a second that we don't try and we don't try and improve what we're doing, but that will always be a challenge.
Does Stephen want to come back off from that? Because I know that, is he still there? I can't see him.
No, I'm
yeah, oh, you're there.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm basing my question on what you said, so it'll be interesting to see what your feedback is on that.
Yeah, I mean, Jules is right that there's lots going on, and a whole set of acronyms and initiatives, and therefore disentangling the impact of one, particularly if it's relatively small in the scale of the whole system, is quite difficult. I mean, you can evaluate individual programs. I know the GLA is doing that with a number of the things it's doing, and I guess the sort of overall point about are apprenticeships rising faster in London than elsewhere, and particularly at level 3, I would say, but at level 2 as well. And who is getting those apprenticeships? Is it a sort of diverse range that meets London's demographics? That gives you a sense about whether the system as a whole is working. And then if it's not, then you say, well, what's not working here, or what do we need to do a bit more of? So I think there's probably a sort of system as a whole thing, and then there's for individual projects and programs as well.
Thank you. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Chair, could I just add about the importance of that data, though? I mean, we just don't have the data. We don't have apprenticeship data. It's similar to the issue that we've always been asking for about the longitudinal educational outcomes data for those who go through further education. What the gold standard would be us having anonymized data about the school experience of someone, what they attained, what they went on to do in further education, where they did it, what they achieved, and then what did they end up doing, and how much did they end up getting paid. And having that kind of data and analysing it, all anonymous, then we would be able to know what works in the system and what doesn't, and we could fund more of what works. Oh, sorry, we don't have that data. The government does, but they won't share it, despite the fact this is another one of our devolution asks.
Yes, I do remember, I forget which meeting it was, where I think you brought this up previously, and I think it would be fair to say members of the committee were slightly divided about the wisdom of sort of what some of us felt was barcoding the backs of people's necks and scanning them on their journey through life was how some of us, I see.
Yeah, but that data all exists. It's held by the DWP and Treasury, HMRC, and the government collates it and uses it in that way. We're just asking for the same data, all anonymous.
Okay, well, we perhaps won't retread that territory. What I was going to ask, though, was whether Simon or Stephen, whether you had a view on that question about sort of whether the data is available to actually track. Because let me preface that, because I think Assemblymember Bakari's questions were very important, because one of the things that I think we probably would have some cross-party agreement on this. We sit here and we listen to the Mayor's latest initiative. And sometimes what that might look like to a cynical person is a big cash cannon being launched into London, and then afterwards, wherever it lands, targets get painted around it, and we're told that it's been a great success. But it will be helpful for us beforehand to understand what success is supposed to look like, so that we can actually try to judge. So I suppose that's the question we have really is, how would we judge whether it's really been successful? Because saying it's complicated and messy and lots of people are doing things, that's not really an answer to that question. So that's sort of prefacing with, I think, where I'm coming from, and I think some of my fellow Assembly members feel similarly. So perhaps if we go to Simon, what data is there, and what could there be, and do we have enough to actually work out whether these initiatives are working?
Well, I think it's getting a balance between outputs and outcomes. I think there's a lot of data produced by the DFE, but it's very transactional around starts, withdrawals, achievements. I would much favour what Jules is saying about LEO type data, which shows the impact rather than, it's great knowing that you've had X amount of people through the system and you've got X amount completion rate, but what's the impact of that? What's the impact of the training in terms of jobs and progression? So I think the data is there, but it's been shared. But I think there's sometimes too much focus on getting the right measures between outcomes and outputs. I think Stephen's probably more of an expert than me, but that'd be my observations in terms of what's available and what the focus is in, and probably where it needs to shift moving forward.
Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, there's loads of data that's publicly available on the Department for Education website about, not always the easiest to access, but it is there, about how many Londoners are doing apprenticeships and the levels and that sort of thing. And that's one measure of success of the system as a whole. And I think that is worth us all looking at and reflecting on. And if London apprenticeships aren't going up faster than the England average, given London's lowering the league table, that suggests there's something going on we need to look at. The question then about what's the something going on that we need to look at, and how do we assess all these different initiatives? Sometimes initiatives have a collective impact, actually, so it's quite difficult to sort of parcel one thing out after another. You can evaluate these things without the LEO data, and I know the GLA has commissioned, I think, evaluations of a few of its initiatives. So you don't need the LEO data for all of this. You can evaluate in those ways. You can also do lots of qualitative research. You go and talk to people on the ground, go and talk to apprentices, go and talk to young people, talk to providers, employers, and get their experiences, because that's as important as the sort of hard data is as well. And then the LEO data, which, it exists. We've been doing a small project with it, for example, with the Department for Education. So it exists, bringing together that HMRC data and the learner record data. That does give you a really powerful insight. I think it should be better available on a really anonymised basis, but it does give you what the impact of something that happened 7 years ago was. So you're tracking people's earnings through time, and you can say, well, this is this person's earnings now, so what worked for them 5 years ago when they went on an apprenticeship? So it's like looking through a rear view mirror, and you kind of need to do that, but you also need to look ahead a little bit as well. So I think you need that mix of measures. Some are publicly available, others aren't. I would pick up the Ministry of Justice example. They have a data lab where they don't give out the data to everybody, but if you're running a project for ex-offenders, you can send the details of your participants to them, and they will look at the data, and they will try and find a similar group on their database and tell you whether your group were less likely to reoffend or not. So they're keeping the data and protecting that, but you can still put your project in and see how it's doing. That might be an example. We've argued for that on the employment and skills side. That might be something for the Department for Education or the Mayor to try and pitch for as well.
Thank you. That's really useful, actually. Thank you very much. I think we are now on to our final question, which is Assemblymember Polanski.
Thank you. So this is a question for Deputy Mayor and also Michelle as a Deputy for Skills. So the Mayor's manifesto commits to support a Green Skills Academy, and obviously being a member of the Green Group on the committee, I was highly excited about this. But this commits Londoners into new green jobs and apprenticeships. How's the Mayor delivering on this commitment on green apprenticeships?
Yes, his manifesto did commit to that. It's supporting the London Recovery Board's target to double the size of London's green economy and the sector by 2030. That is all going to be about developing the green jobs and skills that the city needs. We've commissioned research on green skills to look at sort of the current provision and courses that do align with that agenda that we fund through the AEB. Level 4 and 5 qualifications and apprenticeships as well are all in that mix and being considered. So training through the AEB, funded through the AEB, is going to help obviously towards that, including apprenticeships. And the Mayor's Academies programme, of course, is going to be is going to help deliver that. One of the strands, as you highlight, is green and green jobs. What is a green job, though? I think the ALP conference is probably grappling with that very question this morning. I mean, clearly there's going to be whole new areas of employment, whether it's in green data management or the installation of electric charging points. There's going to be the adaptation of current jobs, such as installing heat pumps instead of boilers, and so there's going to be those kind of shifts go on that will create a greater demand for upskilling and apprenticeships and higher level apprenticeships for retraining.
I've been looking through the GLA economics, and sorry, I'll come to you in a moment, Michelle. GLA economics report, essentially on identifying green occupations in London. And one of the interesting things is they have a map of London on the back page, and there's a real disparity in some boroughs. So a borough like Lewisham, for instance, seems to be having a lot less take-up of the way that this is identified as a green job than somewhere like the City of London, which seems like it's really taking steps forward. Do you know what's going on there?
What are they? It depends, I suppose, what they are measuring.
So they're looking at 3 different types of jobs, but actually in all 3 different types of jobs.
Yeah, the actual measurement that's happening, because obviously Lewisham, is it individuals or is it actual places of employment? Because that could skew it.
It's individual types of jobs. So there's 3 different categories: emerging green jobs, jobs that aren't green now that are changing to green, and then brand new green jobs such as environmental audits and things like that. But actually in every single category, it's the same pattern, that Lewisham is behind and City of London is well ahead. And I'm not asking you to particularly pick on those boroughs, but I'm just wondering if you had any idea why the disparity is there.
No, we can take that away though and come back to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Michelle, just on the original question as well, from your point of view, how's the Mayor doing on green apprenticeships?
So the academies were launched this week. They haven't got up and running, but I believe there's 7 green-focused academies. There may be more, but we can clarify that. And they're predominantly focused around green construction and digital and green. So again, we'll be able to give you some more information about exactly what kind of jobs and what kind of individuals we're targeting to go into those. As I say, it's just up and running. The other thing that we are doing is cross-GLA work to look at how we can support the green economy more widely and what levers the Mayor can use across each of the different areas to support the green economy more broadly.
Brilliant, thank you. It's good to see there's work happening on this because it's clearly going to be the next chapter and a very important story. Thank you, Chair.
I had a quick supplementary from Assemblymember Bailey, I think.
Just to Jules, can you specify a green job? What is a green job? Because the worry is the Mayor made a promise about increasing the amount of green jobs. That's absolutely great. But what constitutes a green job?
Well, I mean that was the very point that I was just making. That it's perhaps not particularly useful to get too bogged down into trying to define it because it is so far-reaching. Because by defining it, one might be tempted to start trying to trying to limit it. As I said, there are jobs that are changing. There are whole new jobs that are coming forward.
But I beg to differ. If we've been told that the Mayor is going to deliver a doubling of the green economy, then we absolutely have to have some understanding of what the green economy is. We need to
have to have.
I said I beg to differ because if the Mayor has made a pledge to double the size of the green economy, he needs to identify which economy that is. If he's talking about providing green jobs, that's absolutely wonderful. What is a green job? Because what we don't want is double counting, because that takes away from any effort we could put towards developing a green job or a green economy. So I'd be very interested in what the Mayor identified as a green job so we could understand when he produces more of them.
Yeah, well, I think my point is it's an incredibly extensive list. I mean, everything from retrofitting homes, offices and public buildings. It's about electrifying transport. It means greening the energy supply. It means re-engineering business processes. So there's both backroom things, there's digital things, there is on-the-ground things. There are existing jobs that will need to pivot. There will be additional new jobs that I've highlighted. So. One can draw up a very extensive list, all of which will make a demand on the skill system to make us sort of match fit to be able to deliver on the outcome that we want to see.
But that's my point. We would love said extended list. The list could have 10 things on it or 10,000 things on it. That's not a reason not to produce the list. If we've been made, Londoners have been given a pledge to double the size of the green economy, somebody needs to tell us what the Mayor meant by that. And absolutely, we want to know what constitutes a green job so that we can scrutinise if they have been delivered or not. London's economy will deliver new jobs regardless of what anybody else does. The Mayor has made a pledge, so we need to understand what he means when he says a green job, and the length of the list is no bar to doing that.
Yeah, and work is being sort of undertaken on this. I mean, last year we commissioned research to identify the types of skills that Londoners are going to need, and researching the kind of jobs that there are already in place and the ones that will need to change and the additional jobs that will be there. And obviously there are the obvious things like heat pumps and the design of new heating systems, but there's a whole host of roles that you wouldn't necessarily seen as green, but they're critical to a green economy. The nature of kind of bus driving could well change as a result of the changes that will be wrought on transport. Customer relations people will be impacted, as well as the more obvious thing like electricians and heating engineers. There'll be data analysts, software developers.
That's great, but there's two things I'd say. Firstly, all of what you've described, a great deal of that would not be a new job. That's why would not be new jobs. There'd be an adaptation, a change of jobs. That's why we want a definition so we can tell the difference between the two. And the fact that there's lots of things is great. We look forward to that. But the mayor made a pledge and a promise. So are you saying that he cannot tell us what he meant by that, or you say that he doesn't want to tell us? Because somebody does need to give us the list, no matter how long it is.
So sorry, I think it's both the way you're asking the question as well as the acoustics. I'm having trouble discerning what the question is.
The question is very simple. Can the mayor provide us with a list of what he considers green jobs? Also, can the mayor tell us how big he considers the green economy now, so we can then see if he's doubled it, because that was his pledge?
We can come back to the committee with a definition if the committee will find it helpful about what a green job is.
I would suggest,
despite the fact that there are people holding conferences debating about what actually is a green job.
Well, that's great, but the mayor made a pledge before that conference. If they deliver us what is a green job, we really welcome that. But the mayor told us we're going to get green jobs, so we need to understand what the mayor meant. I would suggest, Chair, that would be a very, very welcome thing by this committee. Back to you.
Yes, I think the point that Assemblymember Bailey is getting at, or anyway, the concern that I have, which I think is the same concern, is that the mayor makes a great, sweeping and wonderful sounding pledge about green jobs. And then people say, okay, what does that mean? And then what we're met with is a sort of wall of vagueness. And I think, so for example, my previous career was in IT, so I would run, data networks and communication systems for global companies. Is that a green job? Maybe. Let's say my successor then goes and works for a company that builds, I don't know, coal-fired power stations. Is that a green job? Perhaps not. Same job, though. Somebody becomes a press officer. I don't know if there's an apprenticeship route to becoming a press officer. If they get a job with the mayor as the mayor's press officer, is that a green job? Maybe he's putting out press releases about hydrogen-powered buses. Maybe it is. Who knows? But do you see what I mean? It's the whole concept is so vague as to be meaningless. I think that's the problem. And so until I see any evidence otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, it is a meaningless term. I believe the word puff is the phrase used in the advertising world. It's vague claims that don't actually connect to anything real. We've got to. Is this a quick additional question?
It's a very quick additional question. I'm partly agreeing, but I'm unsurprisingly coming from a different viewpoint, perhaps from my Conservative colleagues. But the Mayor is committed to tackling the climate emergency, and he's also committed to getting to net zero by 2030. So I would argue that the reason why we need that definition is we need to know what is the carbon impact of different types of jobs, what are the emissions, so then we can budget appropriately to know if we're en route to that. Where I would agree is I think at the moment it's very difficult to do that because I understand it's a very complex thing to do. However, I guess I'm looking for your agreement that you would agree that that complexity needs tackling, and ultimately, even if it's not an extensive definition of every single job that's green, we need a clear definition of what would fall into each box and how we're measuring that. Would you agree with that? Thank you.
Well, on that note of colossal agreement, why don't we wind things up there? I'd like to thank our guests this morning. What I would just like to add, in fact, I know some of your answers have been quite technical, for example, about data sources. If you feel there's any additional information, particularly if it's a bit technical, that you feel that the committee ought to know about, please do feel free to write to us and we can include that within our evidence. And with that, you're free to go. We have a couple of little bits of business, but you're very welcome to pack up and continue with your conference elsewhere. Hopefully that's still going on. So can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussions this morning?
Noted.
Brilliant. And can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with the party group lead members to agree any output arising from the discussion?
Agreed.
Brilliant. And the work programme, can I ask the committee to note the work programme?
Noted.
And the date of our next meeting is the 15th of March 2022 at 10 a.m. where we will be on location. I have no urgent business and that concludes today's meeting.
Thank you, Chair.